But Thanos, whatever the stripes of the next government and the next leadership here in the United Kingdom, we know that there are problems and concerns about political paralysis throughout all the major players in Europe at the moment. When you look at Mario Draghi, we have to have a government in Italy by the middle of next year. That would be quite an extraordinary situation if we don't see a resurgence of the far-right left. We know that in France, Macron is looking at how he can have some form of cohesive government. Olaf Scholz has got a cost of living crisis now. You can see the trade deficit in Germany as well, and of course the situation in the United Kingdom. No matter who's in charge in these 4 key countries in Europe, are we in for a period of not only political but also economic consolidation?
Now let's go over.
Is there any way I could get a Queen's feed that doesn't have a studio so I can hear the interviews? Graham? Could you ask the studio if I can get a Queen's feed without the director so I can actually listen to the interview? Because I suspect at some point we're going to be talking about what we said in the interview. Thank you.
Yeah, you want to see that.
John Maguire, thanks very much indeed there. John Maguire with Steve Baker confirming his interest in standing for the leadership. I'm joined by Nick Eardley, who's going to join in a minute. I just want to bring you the reaction from the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, who said on Twitter that the Conservatives have overseen 12 years of economic stagnation, finding public services policies. We don't need to change the Tory at the top. We need a proper change of government. We need a fresh start for Britain. He says it is good news for the country that Boris Johnson has resigned as Prime Minister. It should have happened long ago. He was always unfit for office. He's been responsible for lies, scandal and fraud on an industrial scale. All those who have been complicit should be utterly ashamed. He goes on, the Tory party has inflicted chaos upon the country during the worst cost of living crisis in decades, and they cannot now pretend that they're the ones to sort it out. They've been about for 12 years. The damage they've done is profound. Economic stagnation, running public services, everything is enough. It's enough.
Yes,
we don't change the Tory top. A proper change of government. Nick Eardley is with me now. Just to confirm where we are, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister,
a lot of the government spend.
Boris Johnson including tell us all about resigning and making the Conservative government stays Prime Minister happened already buzzing already with Conservative increase now because of the level of package recorded. Boris Johnson last night he wanted to stay. He has reshuffled more people into the senior vacant. He was pushed over the edge this morning by Nadine Zahawi, the new Chancellor, and Madden Post for just over a day, saying that he wants to change his mind. Michelle Donnelly, the Education Secretary, for just over a day saying that she'd resigned and she thinks Boris Johnson could not make this choice. Forced out the lockdown in the most remarkable circumstances. Writing to many people was on the wall. Rishi Sunak, Sajid Javid walked out on Tuesday. Boris Johnson is doing everything he can to try and cling on, but now it's game over. He's going to resign or announce his resignation.
Very low. To remind us, this has been
but also in the hearts and minds of those who you've got to remember that Boris Johnson,
I think that's why the position was untenable for the Prime Minister. It wasn't like he could just change a policy. It wasn't like he could just tweak a few of his ideas to win his MPs over. This was about him. It reached a point where his party had turned en masse and decided he wasn't going to change his behaviour. So yes, Chris Pincher row has been huge. Chris Pincher, of course, resigned as deputy chief whip last week. Boris Johnson denied that he knew about any allegations against him. His team denied that he knew about any allegations against Mr. Pincher until their story gradually unravelled. It's more than that. It's the by-election losses. It's the resignation of Lord Guy. It's party leader. It's all of these things. Owen Patterson. All of these things have had a humorous effect on the Prime Minister. It's all of the standing of the party and the Chris Pincher row has been run with the solid
Nicola Sturgeon has also tweeted just to say there will be a widespread sense of relief that the chaos of the last few days, indeed months, will come to an end. The notion of Boris Johnson staying on as Prime Minister until autumn seems far from ideal and surely not sustainable. She says Boris Johnson is always manifestly unfit to be Prime Minister and the Tories should never have elected a leader or sustained him in office for as long as they have. The problems run much deeper than the individual. The Westminster system is broken. The democratic deficit in the Westminster government doesn't get fixed and changed in government. None of the alternative Tory MPs will ever be elected as constituents. It's hard to see what those hard Brexit supporting Labour office. That is from Sturgeon. Another reaction of relief. But of course, a lot of criticism as a result.
About the election process.
They are all complicit.
I'm going to read what one Tory MP said to me this morning. This is going to divide the party dramatically. There were warnings on the record yesterday from the allies, Conor Burns, who's the other element. He was saying that this is going to be a bloodbath. There are so many different views on what the party should do next, that it's going to be extremely damaging. I have such a long list of people who I could stand to be the next Tory leader. Well, it's really interesting because they're from different wings of the party. Potentially, none of these are not all different things, but a lot of them. Rishi Sunak, Sajid Javid, Jeremy Hunt, Suella Braverman, Steve Baker. The last two the One Nation more to the centre, a lot of them were sceptical about Brexit over Rishi Sunak this morning leaving his house. The big question he's going to face over the next few hours is whether he wants to move into number 10, having only moved out of number 11 a couple of days ago. Suella Braverman she said she was going to stand.
I mean, this is
I'll go downstairs. He didn't go back down to the
White multi-million British fines as well, along with the Prime Minister, for being yeah, so look, I mean, I think Rishi Sunak will be weighing that up this morning. I've asked some people quite close to him whether it's likely that he will stand. The idea at the moment that Boris Johnson's going to outline to us at some point in the next few hours is that it's a matter of weeks and months before the new Prime Minister is decided upon. I don't think some Tory MPs are going to buy that. I've spoken to some by text in the last 20 minutes or so who are saying the Prime Minister needs to go now. Boris Johnson is waiting office until his successor is chosen. There'll be a big row over that in the next few hours. And all of those potential leadership candidates will be weighing up their options. When do they return? So that was the name that was being mentioned on Tory yesterday. So we've got these are very well last time and we know
Brexit, and he is talking saying evict today or he'll cause carnage. Now he's spent time and will try to stay. No dignity, no interim, while Raab should be interim Prime Minister by the evening. So there is a question about whether Boris Johnson can override the day.
Yes, there are some Tory MPs who are saying to me that they think the Prime Minister needs to go now. The level of bad blood over the last few hours is so significant that they think the Prime Minister simply can't hold on for a few more days, weeks or months.
And the question about that is quite about the absolutely unprecedented political crisis with ministers absent. Questions about whether Boris Johnson with is and what if somebody was a war in Ukraine, but a real economic crisis for millions of people? You need somebody in charge, in office, in power, to do the kind of thing.
You're absolutely right. Boris Johnson was planning to do some pretty radical things with tax cuts in the next few weeks. We heard his team talk about that yesterday with the new Chancellor and Zahawi. I think some Tory MPs would be slightly nervous about putting Boris Johnson in office to do things that they might be comfortable. Now look, this isn't necessarily a majority view. I'm giving you a snapshot of things on whether or not he can stay into office for the next few weeks. There is a sense of some including some representing
Thank you, man. Well done.
Why would you do that? Why would we need a Prime Minister? Why would you suggest that? To send a third photographer to Abingdon Green to photograph the action of his speech. Right. Okay. But no one's interested yet.
They know he's resigning, but no one seems to know when. The other thing is, the reason they brought out the lecture is a fund.
Yeah, they always do,
Yeah, look, I mean, and also when they public opinion, the big fear that Tory MPs had yesterday was the public's turned against the Prime Minister, not just Tory MPs representing them. The dialogue was earlier this morning, that's now suggest.
You won't have covered it in the job levels by
so that's one element. And represent parties going back in terms of the Prime Minister, to have any sort of legacy, to not be the Prime Minister. Obviously he's got the legacy of Brexit, clearly very proud of, but there is a bit of a sense, I think, that he will want to be something in the next few weeks, that he's not just remembered the scandals that have now coached him for office. I'm not sure that all of his MPs will do anything.
That is going to cause some difficulty because many of the ministers who've resigned have resigned because of the questions of integrity and decency, and there will be a fair amount of pressure. Don't know whether it may be a compromise that's removed, but there'll be a fair amount of pressure to say no. Dominic Raab, as Deputy Prime Minister, steps in.
Because that's his role, to step in for the Prime Minister.
Did it during COVID and is generally credited as having done it well.
I mean, when he comes out, he would have agreed with the chair of the 1922 committee what the timeline is, so that would all be agreed by the time he comes out. Presumably he can't do something, well, I mean, he's a very unpredictable character, but could he just say, I'm going to stay till October?
That is part of what I think his intention is to say, I'm stepping down as leader of the Conservative Party, setting in train the election process, but stay until he's replaced as leader, which could well be in September or October.
Okay, let's just talk a bit about legacy, because whatever happens and when all of the mechanics of this are forgotten in future, he's definitely got a place in political history, hasn't he? What would you put at the top of the list? Brexit?
I think Brexit top, but COVID vaccinations next, and the Ukraine as something which, depending on how that evolves, may well be seen as his greatest credit.
Because by leaving the European Union, he was able to step in and offer the support to Zelensky more quickly.
Absolutely, there's no question that is perceived as one of his successes up to now. COVID on exactly the same basis.
Because he was able to buy vaccines before the other European countries.
Absolutely, he developing the vaccines in this country and elsewhere, buying them in large quantities, and therefore being more free than many of the other European countries were.
If Keir Starmer gets away with pushing for a general election, presumably you're quite concerned because the Conservatives have not come out of this well.
They haven't come out of it at all well. There is no doubt the mood amongst Tory MPs is we do not want a general election. We would be livid if one were called
because
by
we'd
the
lose
Prime
our
Minister.
jobs.
Because we would lose our jobs, because it's not just that for the individual MPs it is, but for you're not only there as an MP, but you're there on behalf of the councillors, the associations, etc.
Lord Hayward, thank you so much. We're going to cross to early start now. We're keeping an eye on that door. Okay. Early. What? Okay. Okay, we are going to carry on. Thankfully, you're too good, Lord Hayward. I think that's the headline here. We are keeping our eye on number 10. As that door goes, every time it's giving me a little nervous twitch. I don't know about you, Lord Hayward, but we're basically expecting Boris Johnson to come out. But the tradition is that the lectern would be there before him, right? So we're looking for that.
BBC want me, so I'm conscious that I need to switch across if at all possible.
Yes, well, we can do that any moment now. But in the meantime, we're watching the door go in and out. This is breaking news from 10 Downing Street.
Sure.
Boris Johnson expected to make a statement. We do know that he's going to resign. We know that there have been some negotiations behind the scene, don't we, Nina, about the timeline of his departure. We don't have a written constitution in this country, so these things aren't really laid out in a way that many Americans perhaps would expect. We basically wing it, don't we? But these things come out in the wash.
Makes it quite hard for us journalists, doesn't it? Especially when you're dealing with somebody as unpredictable, with a big character like Boris Johnson. Obviously, yesterday evening, Max, we had all of the furore surrounding the cabinet delegation heading to Downing Street, only to be told that essentially the Prime Minister was back in Parliament, so they couldn't actually tell him that he needed to go in that fashion. So he is an unpredictable leader. Yes, you're absolutely right. And the other question mark people have over the future of the Conservative government as we head towards a leadership contest is what Conservatism will really be in the United Kingdom. You've got to remember that Boris Johnson delivered a thumping majority back in 2019. I covered that election. It was the biggest majority handed to a Conservative Prime Minister since the heydays of Margaret Thatcher's landslide win in the 1980s. But there's many Conservative MPs and Conservative voters who might feel that he squandered that majority, alienating traditional fiscal Conservative values. In particular, I'm talking about the fact that there's been big spending, excuse me, Max, throughout the pandemic on COVID responses, COVID contracts that then there's been question marks over that have come under intense scrutiny, allegedly awarded to people who are close to the government machinery. There's also been COVID loans to support businesses, and there wasn't supposedly enough scrutiny over that. There's a feeling of wastage, if you like, in terms of financial discipline, and at the same time, he's raised taxes to the highest level since World War II. Those are quite different brands of conservatism from the days of Margaret Thatcher. So there's many people who want to get the finances back on track as this country contends with a huge debt pile, and its individual citizens, including some of his Conservative electorate, have to deal with much higher energy costs towards the end of the year. It's going to be a real pincer point, Max.
Absolutely, Quentin. That's Nina's making the right point here. The person that comes in has got to deal with a massive cost of living crisis combined with a huge debt crisis. This tension that existed between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson, which really defined the last few months, was that Boris Johnson wanted to reduce taxes because that's what the Conservatives want, but Rishi Sunak said that that wasn't the best thing for the economy. It's going to be the economy that's going to be the challenge for the next leader of the United Kingdom.
Yes, without a doubt. But Boris Johnson is leaving behind actually a shambles, a big mess. And I think that is a real problem for the succession. The other thing is, I still think Boris Johnson does not understand why he's being forced out. He simply has not got it. He doesn't see the problems that he's created himself. And I think we're not going to see any contrition from him when he comes out and resigns.
If we talk about those three key sort of pillars of legacy we've been talking about this morning, you've got the Brexit, you've got the vaccination programme, and you've got the Ukraine and the response to Ukraine. They're all tied together, aren't they? I mean, that in his mind, they're tied together in that he was able to, lead the world on the vaccine programme because Britain wasn't part of the European Union. He was able to step in and help with Ukraine without going through the European Union. Do you think this is going to be the broad shape of his speech today?
Yes, I think it probably will, but all of those things, he has winged it. That's the character of the man. He winged it on Brexit, leaving a huge shambles, actually, of unresolved issues. He's winged it on Ukraine, which, after all, is going to be a long and very difficult war, which hasn't been resolved by his very supportive rhetoric. And as for COVID, we're seeing a new spike, new problems, problem issue unresolved. The NHS is in an awful mess. So in all of those things, I have no doubt that he will claim minor triumphs, but I fear that the real legacy will be clear later, and his successor is going to have to clear up the mess.
Nina, I want to come to you on the markets, if I could, because there was a brief rise in the pound when we heard that Boris Johnson might be going. Then he said he was staying and it fell back again. Can you just explain what that is? Because it's because of Boris Johnson's relationship with the European Union. It was so tense. People like Macron of France, who just didn't get on with. Whoever replaces Boris Johnson will be seen as a fresh start, at least, and that will be positive for the pound. I mean, how does it play out in the markets?
Well, one thing that international investors obviously hate is having to second guess politicians. especially in today's torpid geopolitical world where everything appears to change from one day to the next. Boris Johnson was viewed as a very chaotic character, and particularly with regard to the dynamics of the pound, there's something that has been making investors awfully uncomfortable recently, Max, and that is this perception that politicians are starting to lobby the central bank, the Bank of England, criticising these supposedly independent policymakers, because the Bank of England was made independent under the former Labour Finance Minister Gordon Brown. That was one of the first things that he did in 1997 when he came into office with Tony Blair. He decided to make sure that the pound was an independent international currency. And there's been this perception over the last couple of months with policymakers, whether it's Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, you're starting to hear this chorus of criticism levelled at the governor of the central bank, saying that essentially our central bankers here in the UK have been asleep at the wheel and haven't been doing enough to contain inflation, which is now at 9.1% in the UK, Max. It's projected to hit over 11% in just a couple of months' time. So that is one of the dynamics that's been causing a lot of jitters, particularly on the currency markets when it comes to cable, which is the pound US dollar market. But the reality, as you said, is also, this is a prime minister who is highly unpredictable. Nobody would have been able to predict that we could have had a situation yesterday evening up into the early hours of this morning where a prime minister's government has told him to go, but he refuses to step down in the United Kingdom. Of course, that's going to be affected in the financial markets, whether it's currencies, equities, and so on and so forth. What people will be looking for, whether it's investors, voters in the future, is transparency. That's something that's been sorely lacking on all of these issues, I'd argue, throughout Boris Johnson's term, whether it's transparency over what did or did happen during that Partygate investigation, which parties he did or didn't attend, what did or did happen when it comes to allegations surrounding Chris Pincher. These are the allegations that has precipitated this situation this week, what the Prime Minister did or didn't know, and then, of course, when it comes to the pandemic response, what was or wasn't known heading into COVID, and whether or not this government originally pursued that ill-fated strategy of a herd immunity before realising that it was going to cost more than 100,000 lives. These are things that people in the electorate are extremely angry about. And so I think whether it's investors, whether it's the UK getting its footing back on the international stage financially, transparency is something that they'll all be looking for the next person who walks in that door in Downing Street, and not from the one who walks out in a few minutes' time, Max.
Nina, thank you very much indeed. We're joined here by Andrew Bridgen. He's a member of the Conservative Party, a big Brexiteer as well. That will be Boris Johnson's big legacy, won't it? Is there a sense of sadness on your part today?
There is, and relief that he's done finally the right thing for the country. His position had become untenable. The government couldn't govern. Nobody wanted to serve under him. But at last he has put the country first and will be tendering his resignation.
What's your understanding about how things played out behind the scenes this morning?
Well, I'm told that, as I predicted last night, that Sir Graham Brady went to see the Prime Minister after he'd met with Cabinet colleagues who'd urged him to resign.
Graham Brady's the head of the Backbench Committee.
1922 committee, and Boris told him to go away. He's been again there this morning. I think the Prime Minister's had time to reflect on the position yesterday. It seems that Boris Johnson and a few of his die-hard loyalists around him were the only people in the country who thought his position he could continue, and I think, having slept on it, met with Sir Graham Brady this morning. There's no doubt I was going to stand for the committee. The elections would have been on Monday. We would have changed the rules. We would have had another confidence vote on Tuesday, and it would have been humiliating for the Prime Minister. He wouldn't have got 100 votes out of 360.
So what would have happened in that conversation this morning? Because they have to have a negotiation, don't they, about when he actually goes. Will he, first of all, be a caretaker Prime Minister?
I don't think he will. I think, given what's gone on, I think it's best that Boris Johnson leaves as soon as possible.
Because you guys don't trust him, even as a caretaker?
I think we need to move on now. I think too much has been said and too much has been done. I think he needs to move away from Downing Street. We need an interim Prime Minister, whether that's Dominic Raab or in fact Sir Graham Brady could perhaps stand in while we carry out the process of electing a new leader.
How does that work though? So when he comes out, does he leave today?
Well, he'll need time to pack his stuff up, but
pretty much.
Pretty much.
So how do you get approval for who you want to replace him?
Well, I'm sure that'll be the negotiations with the party, but that's
that been decided already.
It could well be. We'll see the statement when it comes out.
So when you suggest Dominic Raab, that's because he's the Deputy Prime Minister and his job is to step in if he's incapacitated. And so Graham Brady is someone who chairs the backbenchers and is widely respected throughout the party. So they're the least controversial options. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Any other options that could be considered?
I'm sure there are many other options that be considered, but it's a bit above my pay grade. But we need to make a decision quickly.
Okay.
But in my personal view, and I think the view of a lot of backbenchers and probably a lot of the public, that given what's gone on, I think
it's got to go. But how widespread is that view? Are you in the minority? Do you think?
We'll see, won't we?
And there'll be a vote on that presumably today.
Well, there could be a vote on it of the party, or there might not be.
Okay. Thank you. Andrew Bridgen, appreciate your time today. Let's go to Nada. Nada, you're in Downing Street. I think Andrew's just made the speech a bit more interesting because this could be, you know, the last time we see him come out of Downing Street, when many people had considered he could be a caretaker Prime Minister, but he could be out altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. This could be the last day for the Prime Minister. This could be the end of his tenure as the leader of the Conservative Party, if he is indeed to not take that role as a caretaker Prime Minister over the coming months. There was some speculation that he would stay on until the party conference in October, but of course, as you mentioned earlier, that is a pretty long time for him to stay in office, given the fact that he has lost the trust and lost the support of so many of his Conservative MPs. And as you mentioned, that polling data earlier, 7 in 10 British adults believe the Prime Minister should step down. So clearly he's lost the support and the trust of the electorate too. So of course waiting until October feels like a very long time for Boris Johnson to remain here at 10 Downing Street. Now up until this point he has proven to have a defiant front. He said he would push through this latest challenge. We've seen him push through previous scandals and challenges, but of course now we are just waiting for him to come out to make that statement to resign. I can tell you the media has gathered here. It is pretty crowded here at Downing Street. We are waiting for that lectern to come out to give us a sign that Prime Minister Boris Johnson is about to give his statements. Could be very well be his final statement, at least as Prime Minister, as we wait for that to kind of go over the next steps, really. What happens next? There is still a little bit of uncertainty around what that next phase would look like, and we are waiting to hear more details on that front. And as I mentioned earlier, there is still quite a bit of division within the Conservative Party as to who would really be the front runner in that race to be the next leader of the Conservative Party and of course the leader of the government. And questions as to whether or not that could see a local election, a general election brought about even sooner than expected.
Okay, let's speak to Quentin quickly on this thought that Boris Johnson could be out today because backbench MPs or members of the party don't trust him enough even to be a caretaker Prime Minister. That was just the view of one backbench MP, Quentin, but do you think that could be widespread enough to push through?
Well, I certainly think that feeling is quite widespread, because look at all the negative stuff that has been said about Johnson in the last 48 hours. I mean, some pretty devastating criticism from people who otherwise you would have thought would have been backing him. So he is damaged goods now, and I think they desperately need somebody to hold the fort. Is Dominic Raab that person? I mean, he is the Deputy Prime Minister, but he doesn't look like a strong pair of hands. I think they've got a real problem, and I think Graham Brady is going to have to come up with some fairly dramatic solutions in the 1922 committee to actually fill the space.
Well, the suggestion, the alternative to Dominic Raab is Sir Graham Brady himself, because he is this widely respected, non-controversial figure and a classic caretaker. Do you think that's going to be the compromise candidate?
I would be very surprised. He's a very colourless figure, and there are such big problems out there on the economy, on energy prices, on Ukraine, on indeed the Northern Ireland Protocol and relations with the EU. These are all very big issues that need dealing with, and it needs a steady pair of hands to do that. Somehow they've got to find, and at least Raab has been in there and has the experience of sitting in the cabinet and knowing how it's all going.
Okay, Quentin, appreciate your time with us today. Thank you very much indeed. We don't know what's going to happen until Boris Johnson comes out and actually makes his announcements, but all of these decisions would have been made before he does. There's lots of negotiation going on behind the scenes. So Graham Brady is this very he's not a powerful figure, but he's a very key figure. He represents backbenchers, and he's always had this huge amount of respect amongst everyone in his party. And as Quentin described him as a colourless figure, I mean, that's really his shtick, that he's very reliable and trustworthy. He went into Downing Street last night. He was told to leave effectively by Boris Johnson because Boris Johnson refused to resign. Graham Brady was back in there this morning, and that appears to have been the turning point in Boris Johnson's thinking, having thought about it overnight and slept on it. So many big issues for whoever comes in to replace Boris Johnson, and immediate issues as well. Nina, there's these immediate issues with the economy and with how to handle, the ongoing Ukraine crisis, but there are other issues as well that have to be addressed, and whoever replaces him have to jump on straight away. And perhaps Dominic Raab is in the best position to do that because he's been in the room as Boris Johnson has made these big decisions.
He's been in the room, but he's also made himself rather unpopular in the UK by attempting to redraft the human rights legislation, to come out of the European Court of Human Rights and try and redraft the UK's own so-called Bill of Rights. And that's been sort of widely excoriated by many members of the legal community here in the United Kingdom, picking holes in that legislation and saying that essentially it's draconian, and that it could repeal some important aspects of human rights, not least human rights that were tested when, of course, the UK tried to send asylum seekers, migrants here to this country over to Rwanda recently. So he is somebody who's viewed as a divisive figure, Dominic Raab, sometimes among the electorate. Also, his seat here, Esher in the UK, right on the fringe of London, a sort of wealthy commuter belt, isn't as safe as it looks, actually, Dominic Raab. So if there were another election, that could be a big question mark, just as you heard there. The Uxbridge and Ruislip seat, if Boris Johnson decides to give up on politics after today and pursue a media career, that could be up for a by-election as well. So these are big concerns for the Conservative Party. Another big concern that Boris Johnson will be leaving behind is the legacy of his politics and Brexit that he so powerfully energised will be the potential fraying of the whole of the United Kingdom. And I'm thinking notably about the Scottish National Party and Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, who will be reinvigorated by what has happened today. So just yesterday, Boris Johnson rejected her call a week earlier for another referendum on Scottish independence. You remember, you and I, Max, covered this back in 2014 when there was a vote announced by David Cameron, and 55% of the Scottish people, when asked, decided to stay inside the UK. But the polling numbers look completely different now, and Nicola Sturgeon may well want to capitalise on her opportunity. Now, Boris Johnson yesterday said that this had been settled for once in a generation, but her agenda will still be to try and pursue what's called a consultative referendum to give people a chance to express their opinion, a little bit like what Catalonia did in Spain a few years ago. And that, again, could be further divisive because remember that the Scottish National Party also has a big faction inside the UK Parliament, inside the House of Commons, and their leader, Ian Blackford, has been very, very critical of Boris Johnson of late. It's not just Scotland as well. We've also got Northern Ireland to consider too, because because of the way that this part of the UK, which is the northern part of Ireland, sharing a border with the Republic of Ireland that is still inside the EU, the way how it's governed is to do with an assembly that has to have the three main parties involved, but that assembly hasn't been able to form for a number of years. In fact, the biggest party now is Sinn Féin, which advocates for a united Ireland. That's the bedrock of its policies. So the fraying of various parts of the United Kingdom is something that somebody will have to get onto straight away to try and avoid these individual factions trying to lobby for breaking away from the rest of the kingdom. Might sound far-fetched, but, you know, it's still something to consider.
Yeah, Nina, thank you. All eyes on, all the eyes around the world really on that door. Number 10 Downing Street. Boris Johnson is going to resign. What we're trying to figure out is the terms of that resignation. We were talking to Andrew Bridgen earlier. He's a backbench Conservative Member of Parliament. He's saying that Boris Johnson can't do the normal thing, which would be to stay in power until a new leader is elected. He has lost so much credibility, it just won't work. And I'm just looking at this tweet from George Freeman. He's a former minister from the same party, saying that Boris Johnson needs to hand in the seals of office, apologise to Her Majesty and advise her to call for a caretaker Prime Minister to take over today so that the Conservatives can get back to work and the operations of government can be back up and running. I know the Queen is in Windsor. She won't be getting involved, Nada, with any of the negotiations, but she does need to be available if Boris Johnson's going to be out of office today, and she'll have to appoint a caretaker as well. You know, lots of discussion with the people we were talking about earlier about who that caretaker might be. But I'm sure Boris Johnson is going to be resisting that, isn't he?
We've seen Boris Johnson resisting a lot of things over recent weeks and months, denying allegations of being involved in the Partygate scandal, denying that those local election losses, historic losses, were a significant blow to the Conservative Party, pushing forward with what he said were his policy priorities, something he said the British public wanted. And now, of course, most recently, over the last just over 24 hours, we've seen the Prime Minister pushing forward that defiant front, saying that he would continue that fighting effort to push forward as Prime Minister, ignoring the repeated resignations we saw yesterday, ignoring the calls from some of his most senior cabinet ministers and most loyal allies really within the Conservative Party to step down. But of course now that decision has been made. The Prime Minister will be stepping down, announcing his resignation shortly later today. We're also waiting for that podium to come up here on Downing Street. There are quite a significant presence here by the media waiting for that official statement. It will be interesting to see what approach the Prime Minister takes. We are expecting him, of course, to focus on his policy successes, perhaps focusing, as you heard earlier, on the success of the COVID vaccine rollout. That, of course, took a significant chunk of his premiership, focusing on the response to the pandemic. And, of course, most recently, his role in supporting Ukraine, President Zelensky, in the war against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But there has been significant criticism that he has quite often and repeatedly deflected. With the Partygate scandal, we saw him ignoring that. He conceded and acknowledged that he was party to those gatherings and acknowledged that it was wrong. But this came after weeks of denying that, weeks of actually saying the exact opposite. And now there has been serious criticism of the Prime Minister, who has been seen, not only by members of the public, but by his own party, to have lied on repeated occasions. Of course, that crisis was recently around the appointment of Chris Fincher, the former Deputy Chief Whip. The Prime Minister initially, Downing Street, denying that the Prime Minister was aware of sexual assault allegations laid against Chris Fincher, despite the fact that one was upheld. And it later became clear that the Prime Minister was actually told in person about these allegations before he appointed him. So there have been some real questions around the Prime Minister's judgment, around the Prime Minister's integrity. So far, he's remained defiant. He's pushed through those he appeared to have thought that he could potentially weather this latest storm as well, but that obviously isn't the case. More than 50 MPs have now issued their resignations. That is a significant number, and of course among those are some of the Prime Minister's most loyal and closest allies from within his cabinet office, senior ministers. I think what was also interesting, as you mentioned earlier, we saw not only those stepping down, criticising the Prime Minister, calling on him to resign, but we also saw ministers still in office in the cabinet office, namely Nadhim Zahawi, the Prime Minister's number to the Chancellor of the Exchequer just appointed. He shared that letter publicly this morning on Twitter, calling on the Prime Minister to resign. So clearly we saw that significant shift. Whether or not he can stay in office until October, until that party conference, is still the question. It appears he doesn't have the trust or the support of his party or of the British public, and keeping him in position for those next couple of months is seeming more and more difficult and more unlikely, quite frankly. Max?
Okay, Nada, thank you. All eyes on the door at 10 Downing Street and whether or not Electon comes out into the street. That will be the signal that Boris Johnson will come out and make a major national address. I don't think it's going to be anything less than that, because it's about the future of the premiership of this country. Much to be done behind the scenes, of course. The main thing for Boris Johnson to consider right now is when he goes, and we've been speaking to backbenchers who are very clear that they want him to go today. They don't want him as a caretaker Prime Minister. That then takes you on to the level of conversations with the Queen at Buckingham Palace. Actually, she's at Windsor at the moment, not at Buckingham Palace. What sort of conversations would go on there? Well, you know, if there is going to be a caretaker Prime Minister, she needs to be informed on who to appoint. If there isn't going to be a caretaker Prime Minister, then Boris Johnson needs to have a conversation about staying on as Prime Minister. He needs her approval. That won't be a political decision. She will automatically give approval because she acts on the advice of her ministers. But she will be very involved and very available today in Windsor. Then we need to sort of consider what Boris Johnson might say when he comes out, and I think a lot of it will be about legacy, because this is a moment where he can talk about legacy and the whole world will be listening. So that will be a conversation, I think, predominantly about Brexit, something that he led the charge on and he owns more than any other politician, really, arguably. And then how he handled the vaccination process as well. That was seen as a triumph, and also his support of the Ukrainian government in the war there. Steve Baker, Member of Parliament, how's this been going for you?
Well, it's a very, very sad day today. I mean, I helped Boris Johnson become Prime Minister. I helped him get majority of 80. It's been a time of crisis for several years, so it's a very sad day. But honestly, I'm relieved. He's made the right decision. We now need to move swiftly to a leadership contest.
What about a caretaker Prime Minister? Who should that be?
Oh, it should be Dominic Raab, since he's the Deputy Prime Minister. It's a
so
formal
it shouldn't
role.
Be Boris Johnson?
Well, so I am absolutely determined that we must not prolong this crisis. If it's agreed within government that Boris Johnson should continue as caretaker, then that's fine with me, because we need to just end the crisis, get into a leadership contest, start afresh in September. But for my preference, Dominic would step up, because I don't think it's in Boris's interests now to continue.
What are your colleagues saying about that? Is that the widespread view?
Well, this morning I've spent, I'm afraid, my time satisfying interviewers. I'm going to go back to Parliament.
You have
shortly.
WhatsApp, though.
I do, and WhatsApp is absolutely awash with media bids. So I hope your viewers will understand I need to get back into Parliament.
Is it very likely that he's going to come out and say, I'm going today?
I don't think it's very likely. My absolute priority right now is the political stability of the United Kingdom. If that means Boris continuing as caretaker, that's fine. But whether it's Boris or Dominic, what we need is just a policy of continuity now, and to focus on a leadership change.
If it's not Boris, is the general agreement that it should be Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, I think it's too early to say. We need to talk about that today. But he is, after all, the Deputy Prime Minister, and I would expect
And that's his job?
He took the job, he should do it.
I'm only asking because the name Graham Brady has been suggested to me as well as the chairman of the Backbench Committee.
But it would not normally be the case, I don't think, that the 1922 chairman would take it on. But, you know, Dominic Raab may wish to run for the leadership, but I will be plain, if I was in Dominic Raab's shoes, I would seek to deputise.
Would that discount him from running for the leadership if he was the caretaker?
If he did it, it would, yes.
So that makes it more complicated, doesn't it?
I'm afraid
he could say no.
But let's be clear about this. This is a thing I've mentioned because I believe in it.
Yeah.
But, I want us to have political stability. If that means Boris staying, that's fine.
What do you think he's going to say in his speech?
Well, I don't know, but I think he needs to rescue his legacy. I'm very, very clear that Boris Johnson rescued this country from a hideous political crisis in 2019. We tested our uncodified constitution almost to destruction, almost destroyed the Conservative Party, almost ushered in a hard left Labour government that would have destroyed this country for generations. And Boris rescued us from all of that.
Because he had this fantastic victory in the general election.
Which some of us helped him get. Yeah.
But at the same time, he's arguably destroyed it now to the point where if there was an election now, none of your party want one because you know you're going to lose your seats because he's been a disaster in recent months for the party.
I think well, yes, but let's just think about what people need in the UK. They need good quality government and a choice of good quality governments. We're in an extraordinary position at the moment. Clearly the Conservative Party isn't right now forming a good government. We need to sort that out. But the Labour Party's in a position where if Keir Starmer is fined, he might have to resign.
Okay,
so he's the leader of the opposition.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a beergate, they're calling it, where he was.
Yeah, he was videoed
drinking beer.
He was
during
videoed
lockdown.
having beers. Now he's very decently said he'll resign if he's fined, but we could not possibly go into an election with neither party well led.
Okay, in terms of just the mechanics on, what happens in terms of voting, whether or not there'll be a caretaker, could you just explain how quickly that could happen and how that works?
Well, whether or not there's to be a caretaker is something that will be decided in government in the next few hours. But the mechanism is that we need to have elections amongst the Conservative Party for next leader, and that can happen in the next 2 weeks.
And just a final thought on when you expect Boris Johnson to come out. Is there any word on that?
I will find out as soon as possible, but I don't know now. I would have thought he'll do it to stabilise the agenda by lunchtime, I would hope.
Steve Baker, appreciate spending time with us because you've got probably the busiest day you've had this year.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you very much indeed. Nick Robertson, Nada, both outside 10 Downing Street. So, we've gone past whether or not he's going to resign, Nick. We're now talking about who's going to replace him as caretaker, which is an extraordinary turn of events in an extraordinary series of events.
Oh, absolutely, and there are several ways to look at this. What is going to be right for the party, which is obviously going to be the party's instincts, and what's going to look right and feel right to the international community. And here I think obviously of the conflict in Ukraine and the strong support that Boris Johnson has and his government under him has given to Ukraine and the strong position they've taken relative to allies and partners. But I think too the European Union, who are looking at the UK right now, apparently on a path they feel is heading towards a trade war over the British government's plan to pass legislation that would break the Northern Ireland protocols, which are part of an internationally agreed treaty, of which the United States has interest in. So does this caretaker steer the party more in this direction or not? And that's what international partners of the UK will be looking for. But at the moment, of course, it's far more important for the party to find a steadying pair of hands that can get the country to the next step. And part of that next step could be facing down what we essentially hear from the opposition, from the leader of the opposition today, saying it's not good enough. And he said this yesterday in Parliament, and others in his party have said it recently. It's not good enough for Boris Johnson to just to step down. The whole party has to go. He's implying that there should be a general election. It'll be hard to see that pulled off quickly. But, a caretaker prime minister could find themselves facing a scenario where there's huge pressure for an election. That's not to say that it would happen, but the party has to prepare for all these things, not just to find a suitable person, a safe pair of hands, but for many eventualities, potentially entering into more fractious relationships with the European Union, potentially entering into a general election cycle.
And Nada, do you not think they're popping champagne in European capitals today? Because he was such an unpopular figure. You always saw it within those sort of European summits, didn't you? This was the guy that led the UK out of the European project, which they are so invested in, and anyone's going to be better than him.
Well, look, Max, that might be the case, but of course there are questions around who will succeed Prime Minister Boris Johnson and whether or not that will see a significant shift in the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. That, of course, will be a key focus. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, we are expecting him to make a statement just in a few hours, and of course Brexit will likely be a key focus of his legacy stepping forward. He did come in with the pledge to get Brexit done, and he does continue to believe that the British government has succeeded on many fronts when it comes to Brexit. But of course, when it does come to that European Union response, there has been quite a fractured relationship there. So it will be interesting to see how that shifts with regards to the next Prime Minister, whoever that may be. Of course, we are seeing responses from the leaders here in the UK as well. Just in the last few moments, we've heard from the Welsh First Minister saying that Boris Johnson has done the right thing. All 4 nations need a stable UK government, and I am therefore pleased to see the Prime Minister has now done the right thing and agreed to resign. We've also heard from the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, describing this as a relief after months of chaos. Of course, we've seen the British government engulfed in that chaos for several months now, and that, of course, has taken the focus away from other key policy areas. That'll be the focus and the challenge, of course, for whoever steps in next.
Nick, I think one capital that may be very disappointed at this news might be Kyiv, because Boris Johnson has been regarded as a hero, hasn't he, there? Constantly praised by Zelensky and his government.
Absolutely, and you know, talking to Ukrainians wherever you find them these days, having fled Ukraine and in Europe, they will all tell you they love Boris Johnson. They are very grateful for what he has done. That, you know, we heard Boris Johnson yesterday, and one of his speeches pointing out that, you know, the UK was the first European country to step up and send weapons to Ukraine. The Ukrainians like that. The president of Ukraine like that. He will have understood the precarious situation of Boris Johnson and appeared to sort of wanted to repay it at times by saying, you know, by praising Boris Johnson. Of course, domestically, it was seen very much as Boris Johnson trying to sort of gain some stature, hold on to his position, make his leadership look more stable by having this support, strong support for Ukraine. So I think there was certainly, from a Ukrainian perspective, good. From a UK perspective, perhaps not so much. But I have to say, listening to at least one of Boris Johnson's senior colleagues last night, the Attorney General, throwing her hat in the ring for the leadership race, outlining her positions, she was sounding very sort of strong, leaning towards following through on what the government was doing in terms of the legislation for breaking some of the Northern Ireland protocols. We've heard similar strong language in that kind of vein from the current Foreign Minister, Liz Truss, who has indicated that she would be in the leadership race and does seem to be one of the more popular figures from within the party, within the leadership race. So the drift at the moment is not to back away from Boris Johnson's current positions that would put the party and the government more in conflict with the European Union, but perhaps try to pander, if you will, to that wing of the party for that candidate to get the necessary support to become party leader. So we may, on the international stage, may not see huge changes. Those are the indications at the moment. Of course, since Boris Johnson announced that he was going to go, many things can change, and we can hear a lot more versions of what people are actually thinking. But from what we've heard so far, in terms of international partners, the trajectory would stay the same. And of course, Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, is another name up there with Liz Truss, and not that he's putting himself forward, but a popular person in the party potentially to replace Boris Johnson. And as Defence Secretary, one could expect him to take a strongly supportive position of allies.
Okay, guys, thank you. Liz Truss currently cutting short her visit to Indonesia, we're told. Andrew Barry is Scottish Conservative Member of Parliament. What a morning.
Yeah, what a morning indeed. Just when you think you've seen it all over the last 5 years, British politics has the ability to continue to surprise.
But even now we're talking about who's going to be caretaker, when yesterday the assumption would have been Boris Johnson.
Yeah, I know. So the Prime Minister obviously has announced his intention to resign as leader of the Conservative Party and stay on in a caretaker role. I'm not sure that that's in the best interests of the party, nor indeed the country, but we've achieved our aims. I voted no confidence 4 weeks ago. I resigned as a Vice Chairman of this party in November last year in the wake of the Owen Paterson situation, and I think it's right that the Prime Minister has now recognised that it's time for him to move on. So let's focus on that today, focus on the fact we're going to have a leadership election, and the caretaker stuff I think will take care of itself.
But that's going to be Dominic Raab. I mean, if there is a caretaker, do you think Dominic Raab is the most likely because it's the least controversial choice?
Well, he's the Deputy Prime Minister right now. He's a very safe, competent pair of hands in whom a lot of colleagues have a lot of trust. So yeah, if we were to be in a position of having a caretaker, I think most people.
Do you know that he would take it?
I haven't had that conversation.
You know why I'm asking?
I don't know why you're asking.
Because it would discount him from a leadership
That's very
election.
true. Sorry, I hadn't even thought of that. That's obviously up to Dom. Dom, of course, ran last time, but I'm not in the position of speculating who may or may not run for leader of the party.
Would that decision be made today? Because surely that decision about who takes over would have to be made before Boris comes out, or is that wrong?
I don't know. I was Theresa May's parliamentary private secretary when she resigned as leader, so I know the process for these things. She decided to resign as leader and then stay in post for the leadership election. That's what the current Prime Minister has decided to do. I'm not sure whether the decision on whether he's resigning as Prime Minister would have to be taken today. This is the start of the race for leader, and we need to get that up and running. And maybe over the next few days we can reflect on whether or not the Prime Minister can stay in position.
Theresa May's been very quiet.
Yes, but
have you spoken to her?
I haven't spoken to her, but I'm pretty clear that she's not going to be mounting a second bid to become leader of the Conservative Party.
She could be a caretaker.
She could be a caretaker, absolutely. But as I said, that is quite dangerous speculation at the minute.
It's really desperate times for your party, isn't it? I mean, you'd admit the party's in a terrible state because of what's happened, which is a shame because you know, it was in such a powerful position after Boris Johnson won that resounding win in the election. What's the atmosphere like?
Well, the atmosphere obviously is pretty grim. I think yesterday a combination of amazement, befuddlement and disbelief of what we were witnessing. But the party is still in a strong position. You know, the next few weeks are going to be tricky, difficult. Conservative leadership elections are often likened to circular firing squads, so there will be collateral damage, but after that the party will come together. We still have a huge majority in the House of Commons. When I talk to my constituents and indeed people up and down this country, nobody out there is saying that the answer to all of our woes is a Keir Starmer Labour government. They want us to get our house in order. This is the beginning of that process.
Keir Starmer wants a general election. That's your worst case scenario though, isn't it?
It was only 3 years ago that the Conservative Party secured an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons. We have a duty to...
So why not have another one?
We have a duty...
Go with Keir, have another election.
We have a duty to the British people to deliver on the manifesto commitments that we promised only in 2019. We're going to get on and do that job once we've got this immediate situation out of the way.
Could you give us a sense of who might run in a leadership election?
Look, the Prime Minister has quite literally just resigned. I don't know who is running. I don't know the positions on which they are standing. So I think everybody knows the names that are being bandied about there, but I'm not going to sit here live on international television and speculate who may or may not.
But have you heard of anyone discounting themselves who we might think might run?
No, and I can't speculate as to who may or may not be discounting themselves or even indeed putting themselves forward.
How would you think, I mean, how would you define Boris Johnson?
I can discount myself live on air. There you go, there's one.
Are you going to run?
No. I'm discounting myself.
You might now. You know, and it's so unpredictable, British politics. You know, we're on an international network and people are looking in thinking, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, I get it.
I mean, it's so chaotic, isn't it? Is this partly linked to the fact that there's no written constitution and there's no, you know,
How will this government continue to be democratically held to account? With the new Education Secretary resigning after 36 hours, which must be a record, there is not a single member in the Department of Education. What does this mean for children taking their exams? What does this mean for the impending childcare cost crisis? And our British national security is at risk too, not least because the Prime Minister thinks he can stay on. With the departure of the Northern Ireland Secretary, only 2 ministers are left able to sign security warrants to approve Secret Service use of sensitive powers. What contingency plans are in place to deal with emergencies in the short term, Mr. Speaker? The Prime Minister has said he will stay on as caretaker. How many more months of chaos does this country have to endure? With dozens of ministerial posts unfilled, who on earth will join the Prime Minister's government now? And how will a half-empty cabinet run the country until October? Mr. Speaker, they will try desperately to change the person at the top, but it's the same old Tory party in government.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I cannot preempt the Prime Minister's statement, and the House and the nation will hear more very shortly. But government and the civil service will continue to...
our views as backbenchers to those in government, and we are now in the situation where we have a leadership election about to begin.
What do you think he'll do now?
That's a question for Boris Johnson. He's eminently capable, incredibly intelligent individual who I'm sure will go on to have a very full and fulfilling life outside of politics.
Outside of politics?
Well, who knows?
Not a Theresa May, then?
Who knows? I think that far too often leaders, former cabinet ministers, former prime ministers exit the political arena far too early. I think we're blessed by having Theresa May, for example, remaining in the House of Commons with her experience that she brings to debates and discussion. It would be eminently welcome if the current Prime Minister was to do the same.
What do you think we've learned from this process? Because last night was a crisis point, wasn't it? Because Peter Bone, who I was speaking to, was very close to Boris Johnson. I said to him yesterday, what happens if the Cabinet goes in and tells him to leave? And Peter Bone said he would have to leave. He didn't leave when that happened. So is there a problem with the systems?
No, there's no problem with the system. The Cabinet went to tell him to leave yesterday evening. This morning, he has resigned.
Left.
So I think we can allow the Prime Minister a night to sleep on what would be a hugely monumental decision, both professionally and, let's not forget, personally. You know, it's not... For as much as I voted no confidence in the Prime Minister, we have to remember at the end of the day that there's an individual, a person in all of this. And he is being asked to leave his job, a job that he has worked to get for his entire political life, in the full gaze of millions of people around the world being booted out of that role. And so we can't forget that. So I think we can allow the Prime Minister one evening's...
I think you got a good point there, because watching yesterday how he was being grilled in Parliament, how he was virtually heckled when he left the chamber. He went into the committee, didn't he? And he was absolutely hammered. And there was a point at which this all became very ugly, and that was probably the point that happened. Wasn't it?
It's deeply personal, because you embody that role. You are, you know, the Prime Minister. So yes, we are getting rid of a leader. We are getting rid of the person that holds that position. But you cannot forget that the individual at the centre of all of this. And so on one level, I do feel deeply sorry for him, having seen what this does to an individual up close the last time it happened.
Andrew Barr, really appreciate you spending so much time with us. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go to Nina now. Nina, I mean, we're waiting to hear, really, aren't we, about this caretaker and who it's going to be. It could still be Boris Johnson, couldn't it? That could be part of the negotiation that happened behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. He's obviously going to be thinking about his future and wanting to secure that legacy, or at least have some sort of say in it over the next few months. This has all come about in very abrupt fashion, and you've repeatedly heard there, Max, many of our commentators here on air saying that they're still not entirely convinced he realises the gravity of the situation and also what has brought it to this point. Now, I would argue that there's been plenty of scandals, plenty of questions over truth, trust and transparency, not just in the last week, but in the months and years gone by. He's about halfway through, 3/4 of the way through his premiership, but it is the type of premiership that started out glowing, didn't it, with an 80-seat majority, a really thumping majority in the House of Commons that many members of his own party perhaps feel, particularly among the staunchest critics, that he might have squandered. What essentially became so difficult over the last few months, since, of course, the Partygate scandal really began to affect his party's ability to win elections, with the last 2 by-elections in the last month that he lost, one to the Liberal Democrats, the more centrist, smaller party, and then another one in a key blue-collar area, if you like, of the UK that his party managed to seize from Labour. It lost that one back to Labour. What really affected Boris Johnson here is that his party view him now as not the person who could secure another electoral victory in the next couple of years. But so, as you said, the question here is how he will be able to shape not just the next few hours, but actually the next couple of months, whether or not he will try and dig his heels in yet again, just as he did yesterday evening, when he appeared not to want to leave Downing Street, whether or not he'll dig his heels in to try and shape whoever becomes the next Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, because that's the other thing. There isn't an obvious candidate, which is why the window is open for him potentially to negotiate. But some of your guests have said they're having none of it, Max.
No. Well, everything's on hold here in Parliament, but, you know, there are still people in Parliament and there's a huge amount of talking going on. We're waiting to hear what Boris Johnson has to say. Everything's really on hold until we know who takes over from him, if indeed it is himself as caretaker. Let's listen into what they're saying in the chamber of the House of Commons.
Sensibly argue that we have a functioning government when this number of people are missing. There are no people, ministers, to do statutory committees and legislation even as we speak. So what is the way forward? He can't just blather at the dispatch box when the government's disintegrating around him.
The business of the House of Commons will continue, and there are ministers to continue in place. I cannot preempt the Prime Minister's statement, but I've spoken to the Cabinet Secretary today, and government and civil service will continue to function in their public duty.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister's statement.
Mr. Carmichael.
Mr. Speaker, can I say I'm delighted to hear the Minister speaking positively about the role of the civil service. It contrasts rather well with the way in which the government in recent years have done nothing but traduce and undermine their position. But I have to say to the Minister, the Prime Minister could not remain as a caretaker. That is just putting the bull in charge of the china shop. And this is not all about ministers and politicians. This is about our constituents and the public services on which they depend and for which now months this government has been unable to deliver for them properly. That's why they all need to go.
The substantive matter that the honourable gentleman mentions is not a matter for me, but I will say that ministers on this bench and in this House will serve the Crown and serve this country as they always have done.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his statement. I'm glad, that, without wishing to preempt the Prime Minister, I'm glad he has finally come to his senses and will be making this statement shortly. I am very, very sad that in the last 48 hours so many honourable and right honourable colleagues have felt the need to resign from government. If those people will not serve this Prime Minister, could I ask my honourable friend to convey to the Prime Minister that it will not be tenable for him to continue as a caretaker if he cannot fill the ministerial appointments he needs to?
Minister.
I'm sure my friend's comment has been noted.
Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a great relief that we will no longer have a Prime Minister who keeps on saying things that turn out subsequently to be untrue. Will the Minister reassure us that the change will take place in hours, not months? And does the Minister recognise that effective democracy depends on ministers telling the truth?
I can only say that the Prime Minister will make a statement shortly.
Sir Matthew Offord.
By those who enthusiastically supported decisions such as voting for Owen Paterson shows how they were unfit to serve as ministers in the beginning. But the governance of this country cannot be allowed to fail. So I would like to ask, when are these vacancies going to be filled? They must be filled immediately, and we cannot allow decisions to be made by other Secretaries of State from other departments. The country deserves better than that.
The government will continue to function, and I have spoken to the head of the civil service to that effect.
Dr. Ruperhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Independent reports that the PM and Tory ministers resigning are entitled to £420,000 of severance pay. At the same time, we've got a government gripped by paralysis and we have a cost of living crisis. Can he confirm now from that dispatch box that they will be forfeiting their right to this? Because we do not reward failure.
The matter that the Honourable Lady refers to is set in statute, so it is a matter for the law, and that law would have been passed by this House.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It was an enormous honour to serve as a Minister in the Home Office until yesterday, tackling violence against women and girls. I know that's a cause that all members of this House care deeply about. While we are discussing these matters, victims of rape, sexual assault, stalking and spiking continue to deserve justice, and they will continue to be victims of crime. Will my right honourable friend give his continued support to the vital work of Operation Soteria and the rape review? Will he join me to put on record my thanks to Detective Chief Constable Maggie Blythe, Chief Constable Sarah Crew, Assistant Commissioner Louisa Rolfe and many other serving senior police officers who I know will capably continue to drive forward this work? And will he also thank the civil servants in the Home Office who I know will continue to do this essential work?
I understand it's good to get on record, but there's a lot of other people I've got to try and get in. Minister.
I will do as she says, and I also commend her for her championship of this very important area. The rate review and the work thereof should, of course, continue.
John Pryor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been times, occasionally, when Prime Ministers have been temporarily incapacitated. There has never been a period in British history where a government has been incapacitated across every department of state. We've just heard how the secret services are being undermined by the current situation, putting national security at risk. At what point is the government going to actually start functioning again?
The government is functioning. I have already mentioned to the House that the great offices of state are still in place. He refers to our security and intelligence services. The Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary are in place.
Mr. Speaker, what provisions have been put in place for the continuing operation of the Partnership Council with the EU and its specialised committees over the coming months?
Well, I think he knows that I attended a meeting of the Partnership Council in Brussels recently. The functions of government, including in the international sphere, will continue apace.
Sir Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you'll be aware that before the House there are before both houses, there are two major bills affecting Northern Ireland. One, the bill on the Northern Ireland Protocol, is the Prime Minister's own decision. The one on Northern Ireland Legacy is very much the now resigned Secretary of State's province. Can we have absolute clarity at this critical moment in the history of Northern Ireland and its relations with both the rest of the UK and Ireland, that we get some sense from this government about how we take these important matters forward?
Well, I'm particularly conscious, of course, of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, to which I think he is referring. The Leader of the House of Commons will be doing the usual business questions and answer session soon in this House.
Neville Roberts.
Yes, the latest Conservative Party psychodrama only emphasised what many of us already know. The UK is a failed state. This government has shown contempt to devolution. You typify it. The Prime Minister's successor will treat the electorate of Wales with the same disdain, and in this palace the circus will roll on. Does he surely not recognise that now is the time for a new constitutional settlement for these islands?
Well, she frequently traduces this country. I disagree with her and could not disagree with her more strongly. She has a separatist agenda, of course, and she wishes for the country to split. But in my view, this country is the greatest country on earth.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the anniversary of 7/7, security is of paramount importance to all of us in this House. With no security minister, a depleted cabinet, a Home Office that was struggling prior to this chaos, what assurances can the Minister give us that the intelligence agencies are receiving all the full ministerial and legal engagement and sign-off in a timely way to keep us all safe?
I cannot discuss the security arrangements of this country from the dispatch box, but the Secretary of State for the Home Department is in place and is responsible for the arrangements appertaining to the security service of this country.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would suggest that the Paymaster General look up the meaning of functioning, because his government is not it. Will the Paymaster General confirm whether the now former Secretary of State for Education will be getting the standard severance package for Secretary of States of 3 months' salary for a job she did for just 36 hours?
Matters such as pay and remuneration are set in statute. They are set in statute, not a matter for me.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The members of Parliament who have eventually forced out the Prime Minister have blindly stood by him during the no confidence vote, have not miraculously found their principles or their voices, but are doing so out of their own naked interest, self-interest. Does the Minister agree with me that a damaged and flailing Prime Minister should go immediately and not hang around like a bad smell until the Tory conference in autumn?
It says here. I cannot preempt the Prime Minister's statement, but the business of government will continue functioning as normal.
Mr. Speaker, it's good to see the Paymaster General, one of the last remaining living crew on the ghost ship HMG. So in an effort to assist the burden of the skeleton crew that remain, would perhaps he like to arrange for the signing of a Section 30 order to begin the process of moving some of the functions of government to a fully functioning set of ministers in Holyrood?
No matter who forms the government of this country, the union of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is of paramount importance, as the people in Scotland themselves decided.
There was an inevitability about what was happening even 24 hours ago, but it just seemed to run into an impasse with the Prime Minister. But really, he has allowed his opponents to come in through the door, if you will. The crack of saying that I will resign, I do recognise that I don't hold the confidence of the party. That's really, the door is wedged open, and it's going to be forcefully open, and it seems that he will be replaced by a caretaker. But at the moment, it's very hard to see the mechanics behind. But part of the process is him writing that legacy speech, and undoubtedly he'll want his hand in it. He'll want it to sound, as he often does in his big speeches, Churchillian in nature. This is the nature of the Prime Minister.
Okay, let's just listen in to the Commons quickly, because they're really there's a cabinet minister there speaking. He's, how much does he know? We don't really know. The conversations are, at the top level at the moment, and probably between the Queen and Boris Johnson. But he is trying to answer what questions he can with members of Parliament about what's going to play out from here. Let's just hear a bit, because we're getting a sense of their concerns.
Could the Minister please take this back to the Prime Minister and urge an urgent resolution and inform the House as soon as possible?
The Prime Minister will be speaking shortly.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, the idea of the Prime Minister continuing as a caretaker will be worrying many, many people. But it's interesting to hear from the BBC that MPs are privately briefing that they're worried about issues, maybe half-jokingly, that the PM might take us to war to avoid leaving office. What are you going to do? What is going to be done to make sure that the opposition can hold a caretaking Prime Minister who has lost the faith of the country and his own government to account?
Politics.
May I gently recommend to the Honourable Lady that she does not listen to gossip and rumour. The fact of the matter is that responsible government in this country will continue.
Mans.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with the resignation this morning of the Secretary of State for Education, following on from her entire Commons ministerial team, the Education Select Committee never even got to ask her about her plans. Mr. Speaker, it's become abundantly clear to almost the entire population that the only functioning cabinet that there's been in 10 Downing Street for months, if not for a few years, has been the Drinks Cabinet. So when will the remnants of this government's front bench accept that they've been in collective denial for just far too long?
Thank you very much.
Well, I think the honourable gentleman asked a rhetorical question, but I would say to him this, that this government will continue to function as the country would expect.
Naz Shah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Looking at many Tory MPs in the lobbies and everywhere, looking at them, I'm using this word sadness. You know something, had it not been for the fact that each and every one of them on those benches upheld and let this Prime Minister carry on. He should have resigned. He should have resigned when Partygate happened. He should have resigned when Durhamgate happened. Exactly. He should have resigned when his ethics advisor resigned. He should have resigned a long, long time ago. But each and every one of them kept him here, and now they're trying to take the moral high ground that he's finally on his way out. So I will not feel sorry for him. How do we hold them to account, Mr. Speaker, when there isn't a governing government? How does the opposition hold them to account?
The people who put the Prime Minister in place are the 14 million people who voted in the general election for this Conservative Party.
Boris Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, this is one of the greatest crises any of us can remember. And in the national interest, surely, even for a short period of time, till the recess, we should work across benches to sort this crisis. And I don't want any laughter here, Mr. Speaker, but I have a great deal of experience in education. There's no education minister on a short-term period. I will be very happy to help. But unpaid, Mr. Speaker, unpaid. But this, our constituents would want us across benches to work together, forget this petty politics and get this government working again.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman, Mr. Speaker, but his services are not required. And the reason his services will not be required is because there are a plethora of talented and dedicated individuals on the benches behind me who will serve in this government.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For many people in Scotland, the outgoing Prime Minister is Westminster personified. Backward, unfit for purpose, delusional and disgraced. And now, just like the union he is the Minister for, he is isolated, broken, bereft of ideas, and his time has come. The party is over. So can he tell me, will there be a leaving do in number 10 tonight? Because we'll be raising a drink in Coatbridge, Chrysler and Bellsill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't think there's any serious answer expected from that frivolous question.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given a majority of government MPs now say the Prime Minister lacks the integrity and honesty required for that post, can the Minister explain what is the basis for the Prime Minister staying in post for a further 3 months?
I would recommend that the honourable gentleman awaits a statement which is due from the Prime Minister shortly.
Margaret Greenman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that our constituents contact us about extremely important matters, and they contact us when they've explored every other avenue to get a resolution to their problems. And we write to ministers on their behalf. And I'm extremely concerned on behalf of my constituents about what this means, not only for the casework that we have already sent to ministers, some of it of extreme importance for people's actual health and survival, but also going forward. It's untenable that the Prime Minister says.
Okay, a taste there really of the conversations going on here in Westminster as we await Boris Johnson to come out of 10 Downing Street and announce his resignation. We know it's happening, we don't know the terms of it, and that's what the debate really is, whether or not Boris Johnson should be the caretaker Prime Minister until a new leader of the Conservative Party is elected. With me is Stuart Andrew. You were a housing minister until yesterday. So you were part of this great resignation. I mean, it's very depressing, actually, all of this, isn't it? Because it's, I mean, we're an international network, and frankly, British politics looks like a complete mess.
It's not great. It's not very dignified. But, you know, one thing, we have been through similar difficulties in the past. And I think one of the things we can do is very quickly get back to some sense of normality, and of course we've got to go through the leadership election, but the functioning of government is really important. I think that should be our focus now, and I hope that that will resume fairly quickly.
Just a thought on what one MP said in the middle of all of that, saying that there are reports around that Boris Johnson might start a war to avoid leaving Downing Street. Obviously you're going to say that's not realistic, but it does speak to the atmosphere and the view of the current Prime Minister.
Do you know, look, I had to make a principled decision yesterday. I sort of wrestled with my conscience probably for a bit too long, if I'm being honest, but equally, I think now we've got to be very careful with the sort of tone of language we use. Those sorts of claims, I think, are not helpful. They're pretty dangerous. People are already focusing on concerns that they have with their own household incomes, the real cost of living pressures that they're facing, and concern about what's going on in countries like Ukraine. So I think we've got to be really careful. Grown-up politics is now needed.
So you're talking about transition. In the, traditionally in this country, transition would mean the Prime Minister would stay in office until a new leader is elected. These are unprecedented times. That's not the consideration right now. It seems that every MP is talking about getting a different interim Prime Minister. Is that your view as well?
So my main focus, if I'm being honest, is a return to functioning government. There are an awful lot of ministers who have gone. And they're not going to
come if he's the interim?
Well, maybe if they know that he's definitely going, they might well do. Okay. But, I think that is a debate we need to have. We need to, it is what normally happens when Theresa May resigned. She continued as Prime Minister until the leadership election was over. So, but, I think that is a debate we need to have probably fairly quickly. We need to bring some certainty to the situation now rather than this, continual state of flux, if you like.
The only person everyone seems to agree on is Dominic Raab, because that's his role, right? He steps in for the Prime Minister. But what if he's running for leadership?
Well, I mean, there's nothing, I don't think there's anything within the rules that would stop
I'm told that he wouldn't be able to. How can he campaign as Prime Minister? He can't be Prime Minister and campaign at the same time.
I suppose, really, technically, we will be electing the leader of the party.
Yes.
So he could, I think.
He had a bit of an advantage, though, wouldn't he?
Well, he would. I'm sure he would. But and I suppose that does throw up the question about whether it is right for someone else to step in if they're going to be a candidate.
Yeah, okay.
So I think this is why I think we do need some careful consideration about what's happening. It's not unprecedented for the Prime Minister to continue in that role until the successor is found.
If there hasn't been any agreement on an interim, could he still come out and give his speech? Presumably he could. Because it wouldn't be his issue who takes over.
Absolutely. I mean, you will wait and see what he is going to say. I suspect that much of this is perhaps what's going on behind those doors at the moment. But, ultimately, he's made the decision to resign, and now we need to focus on who the new leader will be and ultimately our new Prime Minister.
You said you gave your decision about leaving government probably a bit later than you should have done. Reality is that the party did act too late, isn't it? Because it's in a terrible state now, and you could have come out before as much damage was done.
Well, it hasn't been great, I'll be honest, but I think I do think we can repair it. One of the things about the British Conservative Party is it is one of the most successful political parties in the world. And that's because, when we know our back's against the wall, we do unite and we come behind and coalesce around a new leader, which is what we will do. And our focus must be on addressing those serious issues facing the country and ultimately thinking about how we campaign to win the next general election.
How long it takes to rebuild, and it's taken years in the past when you've been in similar situations.
Yes, I think, we've learned a lot of lessons from post-97, and I think, we do have an effective voluntary party. We have a really serious set of colleagues over there who have a lot to offer, and I think we can do this quite quick.
But what you don't have is a very clear, your succession planning has been appalling. There's no one obvious to take over who has the support of the party, but could also potentially win an election.
Well, I think that's been said before, and ultimately somebody does come out of it.
Cameron, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Even Margaret Thatcher, nobody thought she would be the Prime Minister, and she became one of the most successful leaders and Prime Ministers we have ever had. So I'm not that concerned that there isn't at the moment someone who's, assuring to win, because I think they will emerge and we'll get behind them.
Will you emerge?
I think that would be highly unlikely.
Okay. Okay, we're going to speak to Anita Boateng now. Thank you very much indeed for your time. And good luck today. We're all watching that door, aren't we?
Indeed.
Anita, what do you make of today's events?
I think they are once again extraordinary. I'm slightly running out of superlatives to describe what's taken place over the past 72 hours. But I think I kind of felt like from the moment that the Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, a loyal and helpful lieutenant, decided it was time to resign at sort of 7 a.m. this morning, I think it felt as though the Prime Minister's preferred option of awaiting for a vote of confidence to force him out was going to be derailed. And I think that now we're kind of seeing ourselves on that inevitable march to an announcement this afternoon.
In terms of what you expect him to come out and say, you've got experience of being in the Cabinet Office, you've got experience of how they manage the messaging around these events. I mean, one thing that Boris does have to his advantage is his showmanship and his understanding of messaging in the media. And this is, his keynote speech, right? So what will he be considering, and what do you think he will certainly have in this speech coming out?
Yes, and I think that the Prime Minister has always been cognizant of legacy, and so I think it will be very important, and we all know the speech is being worked on as we speak, that he, reflects what he feels have been his considerable achievements in office in the past nearly 3 years. And so, talking about his success in breaking the Brexit deadlock, in that remarkable 80-seat majority result, in his handling of the pandemic, particularly around the vaccinations programme, in his relationship with Zelensky and the fulsome support that the UK has provided in, and I would argue, kind of leading Europe and building a really strong alliance around President Zelensky and the Ukrainian resistance. So I think all of those things will certainly be part of it. I think the real question is sort of how the Prime Minister looks forward to his role, that he has sort of, there's indications from briefings that he will be seeking to be a caretaker Prime Minister from now until when that leadership contest is concluded. And I think there's probably questions there around, for instance, what happens to the ministers? Are people going to be brought back into post? Is there a sort of new cabinet, a sort of version, not sure what version we're up to now, that takes a period forward? Because that obviously has implications for the dynamics within the leadership contest. If some, some potential candidates are in the cabinet, others aren't, or whatever happens. So I think there might be some indications around things like that, but certainly we won't get a sense of, for instance, the timetable of the election and leadership candidate process, because that is determined by the 1922 committee in conjunction with the party chairman.
What's he going to do next? No one seems to think he's going to stay in politics.
I think it is a very difficult thing to remain in Parliament as a former Prime Minister, not just because of the change in your situation and the kind of losing the trappings of office, but actually because eyes do turn to you in moments of import, and it's difficult to have a distinct identity whilst not being seen as a kind of thorn in the side of the successor. So I think there are important things to consider. I personally think Theresa May has made a fantastic contribution, both as a Maidenhead MP, but also as a senior parliamentarian with, wise and sometimes very candid and punchy words as needed. But I think I would be more surprised if he decided that he wanted to remain in Parliament until the next election. But then again, all of this is still to be considered. I would be surprised if he set that out at this stage.
Yes. Okay, Anita, thank you very much indeed. We are waiting to hear. I mean, the only man that knows the answer to these questions is Boris Johnson, and I'm sure only a handful of people around him really know what he's thinking right now, what's going into that speech. But it's a profound speech. It'll go down in history. He'll want to get it right. But if anyone can deliver a good speech, Nada, it is Boris Johnson. And he's so good at giving things a positive spin. What do you think the spin will be today? I guess he can always look back on his legacy and ignore the recent chaos, and basically argue that he believed in what he was doing and he achieved a huge amount. And whatever your criticism of him, he did achieve a lot in office.
Well, absolutely, Max, but what we've seen from the Prime Minister over the last few months in response to those scandals and challenges is an effort to deflect, is an effort to focus on, in his words, as getting the job done, pushing forward with his policy priorities. That was his response to the Partygate scandal, that was his response to those local election losses, and that is what we heard from him yesterday in the House of Commons. He said he believes the British public want the Prime Minister and the government to get on with their policy priorities. He had planned to set forward and outline new economic plans next week. That was his initial prospects for next week. Now, of course, that has all changed. So when we do finally see the Prime Minister stepping out onto Downing Street to give that resignation speech, he will likely, of course, focus on the positive sides of his legacy, perhaps the vaccine rollout program over the course of the COVID pandemic, which was a relative success. Of course, the Prime Minister believes that he got the job done when it came to Brexit as well. His catchphrase going in to government, let's get Brexit done. That was a key focus for him there. And of course, we've also heard from the Prime Minister most recently when it comes to economic reforms, but he also has faced heavy criticism on that front. The cost of living crisis still a huge concern at the forefront of many voters' minds. And the Prime Minister has, quite frankly, according to many voters, failed on that front so far. And of course, we also saw numerous scandals rocking Downing Street over the last couple of months. The Partygate scandal, the Prime Minister directly implicated. We saw those denials from Downing Street famously, and then, of course, those pictures coming out showing the Prime Minister taking part in those social gatherings. Concerns from Conservative MPs themselves over the impact that would have on the party as a whole. We saw those local election losses by the Conservative Party, most recently 2 by-election losses, key losses, historic, and of course that had a negative impact. Many MPs fearing that that could really rub off on their local constituencies and impact their seats come the next general election. So perhaps the Prime Minister won't be focusing on these issues, but that is certainly at the forefront of many Conservative lawmakers' minds, these issues as they step forward into whatever is next. So we still have to wait and see whether or not the Prime Minister will seek to remain in office for the next couple of months up until that party conference in October. For many Conservative MPs, that seems like an impossible thought, given the fact that he has lost the trust and support of so many of his own parliamentarians. Of course, that hasn't stopped Boris Johnson in the past from deflecting, from pushing forward with his view of what he believes is right, but that might prove a little more difficult this time around. Max?
OK, Nada, thank you. Let's speak to Alistair Burt. He's a former Conservative MP. I think you left, didn't you, in 2019, so you got out in time for all of this, but it must have been very depressing to watch it all play out, because at that time, obviously, the party was riding high.
Well, I left after I was sacked by Boris Johnson as a Conservative in Parliament because I refused to support a no-deal Brexit, and I refused to sign a pledge to stand as a candidate that was what I would have to support if that was the ultimate deal he brought back after an election. So I've seen the party go through a lot of change, accept Brexit, which is the inevitable path we follow following the referendum. And of course, as your other contributors have mentioned, there have been a number of storms that I think the Prime Minister and the government have weathered as well as they could. COVID being one, the Ukraine crisis being another. And certainly the Prime Minister will look back on these and should look back on those as successes for the government in a very difficult situation. But the way in which he's leaving and the loss of confidence and the breakdown in integrity and trust has been very deep and very fundamental. And he's leaving in those circumstances rather than being able to congratulate himself on a job well done at this stage.
Well, a lot of current Conservative MPs are talking about how, how successful he was. He had that amazing election with that huge majority, and that was, they can get back to that. But actually, what he's done is leave the party in a worse state than he found it in. So you could argue he's failed in his fundamental role as a leader.
Well, he's leaving in circumstances that he wouldn't have chosen. And I suppose, although it's a harsh judgment, you can't say anything other than he's leaving in circumstances which will suggest failure rather than success. If he was a success, then all the things that you've mentioned, the election results, would have led to a successful government, a series of policies, and also the projection of his own character in a way that MPs and people in his own party could have supported. But he's not leaving that way. That's the truth. And so he's certainly entitled to a good speech now. There'll be a consideration of history. But the truth is there is a huge repair job that needs done now in the Conservative Party. It will need everybody to pull together. It will need an end of the vindictiveness that I think has emanated from Number 10 in the past, connected with some who have operated there over a period of time. There'll have to be a big clear out then. And the new leader will have to build a Conservative Party where everybody wants to work together and where people realise the party is bigger and the ideas and what we will put forward for the British people has got to be bigger than any one individual. And the people in the country have to come first.
The current Conservative MPs won't really go into much debate about who they'll support or who's likely to run an election campaign, a longer-term election campaign, away from this interim role that we've been talking about. You're still very well connected with the Conservative Party. Just tell us who the likely contenders are to replace Boris Johnson in the longer term.
I think the inside track would still suggest a couple of the big hitters who left the other day. The former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and the former Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, are still well thought of. Nadeem Zahawi, who was promoted into a senior position as Chancellor. All these three have strong cabinet experience and are well thought of, even though the circumstances of the last few days will have made life more difficult. But people will need to look ahead, put these things to one side. There are other strong candidates from outside the cabinet. Penny Mordaunt, who many people believe was unfairly sacked some years ago. There's Liz Truss, who is the Foreign Secretary. And there's Ben Wallace, the very well-regarded Defence Secretary, who's done extremely well and has been particularly effective in relation to Ukraine. And then those like Tom Tugendhat, again, a well-thought-of backbencher who chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee and was deliberately not placed in government by Boris Johnson because he was an opponent. So there'll be quite a range of good candidates standing.
OK, Alistair Burt, thank you very much indeed for sparing your time to speak to us today. Chief International Anchor Christian Amanpour listening to that. Christian, the problem is with that long list of names, the public, they don't really resonate with the public, do they? And that was always Boris Johnson's great advantage. He didn't have a contender pushing him out, and he is so good at campaigning.
Well, yes and no. The fact that he was such a great campaigner obviously delivered for the Conservatives in the 2019 election. As we all know, it was a healthy majority. They even bust through the Labour stronghold in the north. The so-called red wall became a blue wall. But the Tory party is known for its electoral ruthlessness. In other words, goodbye to leaders who cannot win anymore. So Johnson was a good campaigner, but he wasn't able to deliver because of his personal integrity problems and because of his plunging personal popularity in the recent local by-elections. And those they lost, and that was a shock to the Conservative Party. And that also resonates with those party poobahs, so to speak, who need to decide about their party future. And so, you know, some have said that, yes, you know, he's a great campaigner, Mayor of London, Prime Minister of Great Britain, etc., but he couldn't govern. And that is also the situation. This is what Rory Stewart told me last night about the issue of governance and personal integrity.
Well, at some basic level, almost anybody in Parliament would be a better Prime Minister than Boris Johnson. I mean, Larry the Downing Street cat at the moment would be a better Prime Minister because the point is that he simply can't govern. The whole thing has become like a reality TV show, and this has been going on for months. It's impossible for him to have a long-term economic policy. It's impossible for him to announce any policies or be taken seriously because every single week there is another scandal, almost all of them of his own creation, almost all of them made worse because he lies and tries to avoid before he finally comes through.
So there, Max, and our viewers, you have it in a nutshell. This was, 13 hours before Boris Johnson announced that he well, his people have announced that he would resign, and we expect him to come out and actually make that formal. And it goes to the heart of what you're asking, and that is governance and who might replace him. And by the way, whether he is a legitimate person to stand as caretaker prime minister until a party leadership conference in the fall. Many are saying that cannot happen precisely because of what Rory Stewart said, that he has so fundamentally lost credibility. He's so fundamentally been rejected by his own party, not to mention the rest of the country, that he just can't. There's so many ministers who've quit because of him. They're not going to come back and say, or at least many of them have said this morning, that if he stays on as caretaker, hang on, I've resigned, I'm not going to come back and work for him, even in an interim capacity. It just wouldn't work. So you know, that's the situation right now. And if you have time, it's about a minute and more. Rory Stewart also laid out the litany of what's led to this. So you decide, Max, whether you want me to throw to that.
Yeah, sorry, we've just had a demonstrator turn up with a speaker giving us a commentary here, so I would miss the last part of that. But in terms of what you expect Boris Johnson to say, you know, he's in this ultimate crisis. He's been in crises before, but he always manages to come up with something that gives it a good spin. How is he ever going to be able to do that today?
Well, I think that people have been saying, those who know him the best, people who've been in Downing Street when former prime ministers have stepped outside that door and announced that they are, you know, no longer able to continue. Theresa May, David Cameron, before that, Margaret Thatcher. Notice they're all Tories. Interesting. And Boris Johnson has, according to historians and those who keep the data records, been in office for precisely the same amount of days as Neville Chamberlain. Think of that for a moment. Neville Chamberlain, Churchill's great nemesis. Boris Johnson continues to compare himself to Churchill. And yet that is the record. I think that what Alistair Burt said, which is really important, is that Boris Johnson gathered around him cabinet members and permanent secretaries and the whole sort of, you know, the whole sort of bureaucracy that was loyal to an ideology. It was the Brexit ideology. It was the ideology of the person and the cult of Boris Johnson. And that is potentially what has caused this crash as well, because Johnson believes that he is the reason for the Tories' success. He, like, for instance, in America, which is an individual-based electoral presidential system. Here in Britain, it's parliamentary. I don't think he fully understands that it's the party, not the individual, and he's having to come to terms with that as well. But he will be able to say in his resignation speech that he did campaign for Brexit, and he did get Brexit done. Now, whether Brexit's a success or not, and whether the population of this country still believe in the success of Brexit, which, as you can see, the polls even on that are shifting downwards, is one thing. But he did do that. That was a promise, that was a campaign, and he did do it. The only thing is that everything else has been less successful. Yes, we had a very successful vaccine rollout, and yes, the government has something to do with that, but so does the private sector, so does the people who actually, the scientists and those who got together to roll out those vaccines. You remember at the beginning, he was under huge criticism, and he himself got COVID for refusing to lock down in time. So it was not a success at the beginning. So it's going to be interesting to see how he and his very capable speechwriters are going to be able to have a legacy speech, which is presumably what he wants when he comes out. Now, we also understand, as we've been saying, that he wants to continue as caretaker. Whether that will be part of his speech and what fresh controversy that ignites, you know, in the aftermath, is we're going to have to wait and see how the party deals with that.
Okay, Christian, thank you. We'll be back with you to get your analysis of his speech, because the world is watching. We've also got Nina Dos Santos, who's following developments for us as well. Nina, I'm just wondering what your contacts around the world are saying, because obviously everyone's tuning into this moment. And Boris Johnson, you know, he was a famous figure on the international circuit, but he wasn't a very popular figure, was he? Particularly in Europe because of Brexit. Will they be celebrating today? Will they be looking forward to a fresh start? I mean, what's the thinking around the world?
I think they're very much hoping for somebody that they can take at their word. word, and somebody who's a bit more of a serious character who they can have a serious policy debate with. And when they sign off on a treaty like the Northern Ireland Protocol, for instance, one of those parts of Brexit that Christian referred to that Boris Johnson will probably claim later on from the lectern that he managed to get done and delivered, well, the UK government is reneging on those types of international treaties. It's quite hard if you're signing treaties like that to unpick a multi-generational relationship with your biggest trading bloc, and then you decide to just rip up parts of the paperwork. Other countries are a bit more reluctant to sign big deals with you as well. And so this country has found it harder to, on the one hand, extricate itself from the EU while at the same time managing to make concrete promises with other potential trading partners because people fear that these kind of agreements that are so important that the country has struck in years gone by are suddenly up for a negotiation under a Conservative government led by Boris Johnson. I'm also thinking about the Good Friday Agreement, which is at risk in Northern Ireland. That could, again, there's fears stoke violence between Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland to the south, which is part of the EU. Even Joe Biden has repeatedly raised concerns about the fraying of the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement as well. So, yes, there will be probably some relief, but also some trepidation in European capitals. And further afield, remember that the G20 is supposed to get underway in Indonesia, and the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, there are reports that she has had to turn around her plane and come back to the UK because obviously this is a government that is collapsing as we speak. So this will have big implications on the international stage, not just in Europe, but further afield as well. And also big implications because the UK is a G7 country and it has lots of investments, lots of international investments are in this country, and they want to know who is going to see this country through to the next chapter. Now, one thing I just want to bring up as an interesting anecdote, you may or may not know that Downing Street holds its annual summer party with the press this evening, but funnily enough, Max, that has suddenly been cancelled because who knows who will be Prime Minister behind that door after midday.
Oh, I was hoping it was still happening. I had an invite, but, you know, might be busy anyway. Nina, thank you. Let's speak now to Chris Philip, Tory MP. You only resigned today.
I did. I resigned very early this morning. I've been battling and wrestling with this question for quite some time. I feel loyalty to Boris Johnson because he won a big general election majority. He appointed me as a minister in his government 3 years ago. I was also working on some quite important legislation, the online safety bill, to keep our citizens safe online. But ultimately, I felt the wider questions around integrity and the proper functioning of our constitution were more important considerations that overshadowed everything else. And that's why early this morning, I reluctantly decided to resign. I sent my letter to the Prime Minister personally by WhatsApp and sent him a respectful message alongside that, just saying that I thought in the interest of the country he should step down. And it's right that he's done so. But I think we should...
How did he respond?
He responded by stepping down an hour later. But look, I think we should keep in mind the achievements that Boris Johnson has managed to deliver, that general election landslide, getting Brexit delivered, getting the vaccine rollout done so successfully, and also, you know, our economy having more payroll jobs than we've had at any time in our history. And we should keep in mind those achievements as we think about the other issues as well.
And we should keep in mind the music, which isn't our soundtrack, is it? This is not the music that you brought today.
I'm afraid we've got a resident lunatic who plays loud music periodically.
A campaigner, we'll call him. It's Bye Bye Boris, Bye Bye. We've heard that before, haven't we? This has been part of the soundtrack, really, though, hasn't it? For the last few months, you know, that guy's been in Downing Street pushing. But why did you wait so long to resign? Is it because of your loyalty to the cause, or that you were just not bold enough to do it sooner?
No, it's something I've been weighing up, but as I say, I did feel loyalty to Boris Johnson for the reasons I mentioned a minute ago. But that loyalty obviously has a breaking point. And I was also conscious of the duty I had getting legislation through Parliament, the online safety bill, the review of our gambling laws. I was conscious of my duty to get those things done. But ultimately, I felt come yesterday evening and this morning that those wider considerations turned out to be, you know, more weighty.
Have you got any sense of negotiation?
Of the House motion, followed by all stages of the Energy, Oil and Gas Profits Levy Bill, followed by a debate on motions relating to the liability of trade unions and proceedings in tort, increase of limits on damages, Order 2022, and the Draft Conduct of Employment Agencies and Employment Businesses Amendment Regulations 2022. Tuesday, the 12th of July, remaining stages of the Online Safety Bill, Day 1, followed by debate on a motion on restoration and renewal of the Palace of Westminster. On Wednesday, the 13th of July, will be consideration in committee of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, Day 1. Thursday, the 14th of July, a debate on a motion on Srebrenica, followed by a general debate on protecting and restoring nature at COP15 and beyond. The subjects for these debates were determined by the Backbench Business Committee. On Friday, the 15th of July, private members' bills. The provisional business for the week commencing the 18th of July includes Monday, the 18th of July, consideration in committee of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, Day 2. Tuesday, the 19th of July, a conclusion of consideration in committee of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, Day 3. Wednesday, the 20th of July, conclusion of remaining stages of the Online Safety Bill. And on Thursday, the 20th of July, business to be determined by the Backbench Business Committee. The House will rise for the summer recess at the conclusion of business on Thursday, the 21st of July, and return on Monday, the 5th of September.
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Leader of the House for the forthcoming business, although his government is clearly not in any position to deliver it. Yep. The Prime Minister is resigning. We're hearing on Twitter there may be cabinet appointments happening, but we've had bills cancelled this morning. There is no doubt, as we have been saying for months, that this government is simply unable to govern. Inflation reaches the highest for 40 years. 59 members of the government, when I last printed out a copy of this speech, I think we're up to now, have resigned, and economic growth grinding to a halt. The Hours in Post Chancellor spending his first day on the job, asking his boss to quit.
not planning for how we're going to deal with the cost of living crisis. Now, as backlog Britain bulges, his Attorney General has been on television announcing her leadership bid. This is far beyond merely a distraction. This is a Tory government paralysed by sleaze and scandal, and with a shameful act of desperation, a Prime Minister dragging the country down with him as he goes, but I'm afraid to say his party has propped him up to do it. Yeah. Even if the Prime Minister is now Prime Minister in name only, and frankly that situation does need to change. There are serial posts in the Treasury, schools, there's no one there, justice, environment, employment, housing, levelling up, the flagship levelling up policy, levelled to where I understand there's only one minister left standing. When will these ministers be replaced? What qualification do you now need to be a minister under this government? Who knows? Who knows? Not just unable to carry out their basic functions in Whitehall, the business of this House can't proceed. And the Right Honourable Gentleman may know that the Paymaster General referred questions about council...
who likes to do things correctly, who has gained a lot of respectability and a lot more recognition because of his role over the war in Ukraine. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, is also very likely indeed to stand. But there are also what could be described as more dark horse candidates. Penny Mordaunt, who at the moment is a more junior minister, she is widely known and liked. She's a good media performer. She did support Brexit. She has perhaps a bit more popular appeal, might perhaps be a more fluent media performer than someone like Ben Wallace. And I would think that all of those three will be amongst the top contenders. But there is going to be probably 8 or 9 other candidates who fancy their chances. And many of them, not only are they not household names to your global audience, Max, but frankly, to many people who watch and follow politics more closely in the UK, they don't know much about them either. So it's going to be an absolutely fascinating contest to see who emerges as the next leader and Prime Minister of the UK.
It was always Boris's advantage, wasn't it, that he was so well known, not just in the UK, but around the world. Carol, thank you very much indeed. Let's speak to the party membership then. John Whittingdale, MP, a very respected, revered mainstay of the party. I mean, what a morning, what a 24 hours.
Absolutely. I am, as you say, I've been in Parliament for 30 years now, and I've never seen anything quite like this. But I was with Margaret Thatcher when she decided that she could no longer continue, and she did so because she no longer had the confidence of enough MPs or ministers in her government. And I have to say, that is the position which has become steadily apparent in the last 24 hours, and I think Boris Johnson had no choice.
But what's different this time is that when the Cabinet asked Margaret Thatcher to leave, she left.
Yes.
And that didn't happen this time.
No, it didn't.
It's extraordinary.
In a way, I'm sad it didn't, because for me, when Rishi Sunak, our Chancellor, and Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, both resigned,
that was the point.
That was the moment when I thought this could not continue. And the last 48 hours have proved that that was the case, and I'm sorry in a way that what has been a rather undignified period was necessary.
What are the conversations going on in the party about who takes over immediately from Boris? Because it seems unlikely that he's going to be the caretaker even.
Well, that is unclear. As I understand it, it's being suggested he will continue until a new leader is elected. And that was what happened, for instance, under Theresa May, when actually Boris Johnson took over. She stayed on until that choice was made. But there's also a wider question that at the moment, not only do we have the Prime Minister going, we have most of the government vacant as a result of these resignations. And it's not yet clear whether or not people can come back into the offices from which they resigned, or whether an entirely new government has to be appointed.
Is it not easier under a different interim leader, someone like Dominic Raab?
Well, that I think is a matter which I'm sure my colleagues are discussing. As I say, I haven't. The Prime Minister has not yet told us his intentions. I was told that he was going to stay to the autumn. I think to some extent, once this question is settled, then it takes the heat out of it. And the Prime Minister can continue with his colleagues knowing that there will be a new leader in place once the process has been completed.
We've got our eyes firmly fixed on the door there in Downing Street. The podium isn't yet out. Are you able to predict what he's going to say? I mean, he's an unpredictable character, but actually his legacy is pretty clear, isn't it?
It is, and I think he has an immense amount of which he can be proud. Boris Johnson has taken the country through the COVID pandemic. He has proved to be the strongest ally of Ukraine against Russian aggression. He won a majority for my party of 80 seats, and of course he delivered Brexit. All of those are big accomplishments, and they will remain. So, I mean, I think he has things he can point to which are to his credit, and I hope he will be remembered for that and perhaps not the events of the last couple of weeks.
When people were watching last night, I'm sure on TV, just wondering what on earth is going on with the United Kingdom, on our network at least, people looking in, it did seem like a complete mess.
Well, I've just been with 50 countries at something called the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I had dinner with 8 congressmen on Tuesday evening, and I was trying to explain to them what was going on in British politics, and I'd say I found it hard to explain what they made of it. Goodness knows.
It'll come out in the wash, isn't the normal answer, isn't it? Yeah. But you know, is there a problem with the system that there isn't? I mean, we always come back to it, don't we? There's no written constitution, but actually, last night would have been much clearer if there was a very clear system in place that they go when the cabinet loses confidence in them.
Well, and that is, of course, ultimately what has happened. The difficulty we've had as a result of the last 48 hours is that it took all these resignations. As we talked about Margaret Thatcher, I mean, her cabinet ministers told her she had to go. They didn't resign, and then whenever process was set underway. This time, they have all left government, and I'm not clear as to whether or not they can just return to their old positions.
Well, we'll find out, hopefully, later on today. Thank you very much for joining us, John Whittendale. Nick Robson's there in Downing Street. Any cabling out yet, Nick?
There isn't, Max, and you would expect that, wouldn't you? It takes a good half an hour or so to get the podium out, to get the speakers out, to get people organised. Might even get an advanced knowledge of the precise time that it would happen at. None of that at the moment. What does seem to be going on behind closed doors at Number 10 is Boris Johnson continuing to appoint ministers, and interestingly, he's appointed Greg Clark to replace the minister whom he fired yesterday. He fired Michael Gove, the Housing and Levelling Up minister, for essentially speaking out against him and advising him that he needed to step down, and Michael Gove was promptly sacked. So the Prime Minister has now filled that position. What other ministerial positions he's going to fill today, and how easy or how difficult that may be given the current feelings within his party, we don't know. But at the moment it seems that's the order of the day, rather than writing this speech which bigs up, what Boris Johnson achieved, as your last guest was saying, on COVID, the strength of relationship with Ukraine, strong partner to the United States, all the achievements that Boris Johnson would want to point to, Brexit. At the moment, it's patching up and repairing the chaos, as others have described it, within his government. It is putting his government back together, which speaks to that other piece of Boris Johnson's apparent plan to carry on as caretaker until later in the year. That obviously doesn't seem like it's going to fly for long, but at the moment, no sign of that cabling and podium, Max.
I just had an email from Prime Minister's office saying they're pleased to approve the appointment of the Right Honourable James Cleverly as a Secretary of State for Education. So it's baffling, isn't it? Why is he appointing cabinet members when he's about to resign? I'm a bit confused.
Because it appears that he would like it to be a post-dated resignation. It appears he would like to present to the party that he carries enough support to be able to put key ministers or fill those vacancies that have been created by people resigning. It's a long list to work through. He's working through, as you say, some of the important positions at the moment, but that's where his priorities are. And it would allow him to present himself as somebody who is still capable, who does carry enough confidence that there's no need to get rid of me. I can still run the government. I can still be a caretaker Prime Minister all the way through till the fall, until the party conference in October. what it's going to take to drill through the message from the rest of the party that is not acceptable isn't clear at the moment. We just don't know what's happening behind the closed doors there, Max. It's being presented at the moment as position normal, carrying on. And I think if you look at what happened last night, you know, Boris Johnson's officials were coming out of Downing Street late last night and saying that he was absolutely determined to fight on, that he was going to continue. He felt confident that he could last the position and last the challenges against him, or that might come against him next week. That was the position late last night. But within 12 hours of those messages, he had announced his resignation. He is, in essence, backing down, not a familiar position for him. Is he going to have to back down further and relinquish control over the party, relinquish his hands on being Prime Minister, and relinquish the ability to appoint replacement ministers for all those who've resigned?
Okay, Nick, Bianca, can you help explain this? He's appointing ministers today. It does suggest, doesn't it, that he is planning to carry on an interim basis at least.
This is the concern that members of Parliament have, because the usual process would be the Prime Minister remains as a de facto caretaker Prime Minister, because we don't officially have that position over here of an interim Prime Minister until a new one is voted on and found to lead the Conservative Party. The worry is, because of how Boris Johnson has demonstrated, he wants to dig in, he wants to remain in power for as long as possible, and all of the indications are that he wants to press ahead with policy, make economic announcements, perhaps decisions on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which will have huge import for the people of Northern Ireland and the people of the UK and the future of Brexit with the EU. And the fact that he's still appointing people, all of this speaks to a Prime Minister who won't be respectful of who will follow, but who is keen to regain whatever he can of a legacy and make an impact until he is forced out ultimately.
I think an extreme example of the alternate fear was from an MP asking a cabinet minister earlier in Parliament whether it was true that Boris Johnson was planning to go to war before he leaves, because they're so concerned that he might do something reckless if he's in a position as interim.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, you and I have seen many analogies made between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. And often, like, it's obvious why they're being made, but sometimes they lack nuance and they're quite lazy. In this circumstance, and with what we've seen from him, desperate to cling to power in the face of huge democratic opposition from within his party, they're not so lazy anymore. And I think there is justified concern about his behaviour, his inability to take the temperature of the party, his unwillingness to recognise that he can't continue and government can't function with this level of internal opposition. So that concern is well founded.
What are you expecting from the speech? Are you expecting... It's going to be about legacy. I mean, I just don't want to predict anything.
Well, exactly.
But surely he's got a legacy he can speak to at least.
Yeah, and his behaviour over this last week has been more unpredictable than I would have imagined, probably you also. So it is very difficult to tell what he might say today. But the assumption would be that he delivered this astonishing election victory back in 2019. He might claim to have having rebuilt the party, rejuvenated the Conservative Party brand, won over the Red Wall, done things that other Conservative Prime Ministers haven't been able to do, and also delivered Brexit. Now, there will be many people out there that say, well, you may have literally delivered Brexit, but the circumstances that the country's been left in, the issues with supply chains, speak to a Brexit which has been chaotic and very unhelpful for the country. But we can be sure that he'll be wanting to big up all of his achievements and perhaps even indicate what he wants to do with his time that remains as Prime Minister. And he's sure also to mention Ukraine.
One thing which will never change is hecklers in the background of your live shots.
Never. And we would never want them to, Max.
They're part of the furniture. My next guest is Niall Gardner. He's the director of the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom. He joins me live from Washington, D.C. I mean, everyone looking in at this from abroad must think the place has gone mad. What's your perspective?
Well, thanks for having me on the show today. What an extraordinary day in British history. And so many events have moved with astonishing speed. I do think as well that, with regard to, Britain's future here, there's a great deal of uncertainty because, after all, Boris Johnson has been a figure who has loomed large over British politics for many years. He's a man who delivered Brexit. He won a huge electoral victory in 2019, and now he's on the way out. And I think that certainly there will be a great deal of concern about what happens next. And certainly my hope that we see a strong British Conservative leader emerge. But without a doubt, I think a Conservative leadership contest can be a game of Russian roulette at times. And so certainly it's my hope that we will see a strong Brexiteer candidate emerging as the winner from this contest. But this is a moment as well, I think, when strong British leadership is needed on the world stage. We have the biggest war in Europe taking place since World War II in Ukraine. We need Britain, fighting fit on the world stage. We need a prime minister who is going to be able to lead Britain effectively in the Brexit era. And so the next few weeks, I think, will be absolutely crucial in deciding Britain's future path and the next prime minister.
He was a formidable figure, wasn't he, on the world stage, and very divisive, certainly in European capitals. He was pretty unpopular, has to be said, because of Brexit. More popular, perhaps, though, in the US. He was very pro-American, but he did have that association with Donald Trump. Will he be missed on the world stage, do you feel?
I think he will be in some quarters, and especially in Ukraine. I think that the Ukrainian people will greatly miss Boris Johnson as British Prime Minister, because he has been a great friend of Ukraine. Also here in the United States, I think Boris has been largely, on the whole, quite popular among US conservatives. They haven't agreed with every aspect of his agenda, but he has been seen as a very strong friend of the US. Perhaps in the White House, of course, with the Biden administration, there will be some who will be cheering Boris Johnson's departure. There were a lot of tensions between Downing Street and the White House under the Boris Johnson premiership. But we could also see, frankly, a significantly stronger British leader emerging, actually, as a result of Boris Johnson's departure. Someone who may be even a more powerful Brexiteer figure. I mean, someone like Liz Truss, for example. And so, I think that here in Washington, they'll be very closely watching the developments in London, but I expect that tensions will remain, especially over the Northern Ireland Protocol issue, where the White House and Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill have been very critical of the UK. I would hope that a new British Prime Minister will stand up to Joe Biden and the Democrats over the Northern Ireland Protocol issue. This is an important issue in terms of British national interest. I expect there will be a continuing close cooperation between London and Washington over the issue of Ukraine and standing up to Russian aggression there. But in the background, we are undoubtedly going to see continuing tensions over the big picture on Brexit. The Biden administration has not been favourable towards Brexit, and so whoever comes in as a new British Prime Minister, I think will have to take on quite a sceptical White House on the Brexit front. But the new British Prime Minister has to stand up for what is in the British national interest, and that is advancing the Brexit agenda, regardless of what the White House thinks.
Comparisons, you got Margaret Thatcher in the title of your organisation. Lots of comparisons to Margaret Thatcher and how she met a similar end. But actually, Boris Johnson pushed it much further, didn't he? Because Margaret Thatcher was faced with her cabinet. They told her to step down, and that was the end. That happened last night here in London as well. But Boris Johnson refused to go. In fact, he started firing people instead. Eventually, it did play through, and he's on his way out today. But he did push things to the extreme, didn't he? This is unprecedented, and it really did test the system.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think Boris Johnson's been far more defiant, and I think his exit is quite different in many respects from that of Margaret Thatcher, and certainly Boris is vowing to stay on in office until October, until the first week of October, when we have the Conservative Party conference, of course, in Birmingham. It remains to be seen, of course, whether Boris will be sort of forced out earlier. And there's a lot of turmoil in London today with, the wave of continuing resignations, a whole raft of new appointments. So he will be under intense pressure, of course, to depart earlier, I think. And without doubt, I think the next few weeks are going to be an extraordinary time in British politics. But I have to say as well, though, that with regard to the Conservative Party at this moment, it's important that the party does not form some kind of circular, firing squad, which then gives an opportunity to the left to seek an early general election. The left, of course, are delighted over the departure of Boris, Boris Johnson. They will see this as an opportunity to aim for an early general election and to retake power. And of course, there are many within the Labour and Liberal parties, and of course the Scottish Nationalists, who will seek to try and reverse Brexit. That's a real danger for the United Kingdom. The Conservatives need to be aware, I think, of the huge stakes involved here. And the left will see this as an opportunity, I think, to try and retake power. And despite what Keir Starmer says, there are many in the Labour Party who would like to reverse Brexit. That would be, in my view, fundamentally undemocratic and against the wishes of the British people. But there are many figures within Labour who would like to do that. And the Conservatives have to be careful not to give the initiative to the left, who seek to overturn, the democratic will of the British people expressed in the 2016 referendum.
Well, he did say the other day that he accepts the outcome of that referendum, and he has certainly today even called for a general election. We'll wait to see how that side plays out as well. Niall, thank you very much indeed for joining us in Washington. Now, one chapter of British politics is about to end and another will begin. Inevitably, any moment now, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, we're told, will emerge from 10 Downing Street and tell the world that he's resigning. It comes after more than 50 members of his own government abandoned him and urged him to step down. Mr Johnson's tenure has been plagued by scandal, but he vowed to fight on until this morning. Earlier, British Labour Party leader Keir Starmer spoke and he outlined his reaction to the news that Boris would resign.
Mr Starmer, what's your feeling about the events unfolding?
He needs to go completely. None of this nonsense about clinging on for a few months. He's inflicted lies, fraud and chaos in the country. And, we're stuck with a government which isn't functioning in the middle of a cost of living crisis. And all of those that have been propping him up should be utterly ashamed of themselves. We've had 12 years of a stagnant economy, 12 years of broken public services, 12 years of empty promises. Enough is enough. And the change we need is not a change at the top of the Tory party. It's much more fundamental than that. We need a change of government and a fresh start for Britain.
It doesn't look like he'll get a general election if he just swaps leaders.
He needs to go. He can't cling on in this way. His own party have finally concluded that he's unfit to be Prime Minister. They can't now inflict him on the country for the next few months. It's obvious he's unfit to be Prime Minister. That's been blindingly obvious for a very, very long time. And if they don't get rid of him, then Labour will step up in the national interest and bring a vote of no confidence, because we can't go on with this Prime Minister clinging on for months and months to come.
Wouldn't that unite the Conservative Party?
I don't think anything is going to unite this Conservative Party. They're tearing each other apart. And what we've got in the middle of a cost of living crisis is a government that can't function. And that's why I say he can't cling on now. They've declared him unfit to be Prime Minister. They can't inflict him on the country for the next few months. If they don't get rid of him, we will bring that vote of no confidence in the national interest, because we can't go on with this broken government led by this discredited Prime Minister.
Boris Johnson, in some ways, was your biggest asset if you were going to go to the country. When you lose him, you will have more of a problem, won't you?
Look, the Conservative Party has been in power for 12 years. 12 years of a stagnant economy. 12 years of broken public services, 12 years of empty promises. We need a fresh start. And that's why I say changing the person at the top of the Conservative Party is not the fundamental change that we need. We need a change of government. We need a fresh start for our country.
But it doesn't look like you will get the general election you would want now, does it?
Well, we need fundamental... The country's crying out for change. We've been stuck with a government that's not been functioning in the middle of a cost of living crisis. And now changing the person at the top of the Conservative Party is not going to make any difference whatsoever. People want change, a fresh start for Britain, and that means we need a change of government. We need a Labour government.
Is there nobody that you would rate as a good opponent? Someone will be in against you?
For me, this isn't a question about who leads the Conservative Party. It's much more fundamental than that. They've been in power for 12 years of empty promises, broken promises, a stagnant economy, wages very, very low, inflation and prices through the roof. We need fundamental change. We need a fresh start for Britain. We need a change of government. We need a Labour government.
Lastly, I just want to ask you, given what you say about the government, you haven't cut through as you might want to. How can you do something about that now?
We've come from a general election in 2019 where we did very badly, to local elections this year where we made considerable ground, and a by-election win 2 weeks ago today in Wakefield with a huge swing to the Labour Party. So we're on track, and that's why we say the change we need is a change of government, a Labour government. We're ready for that.
Thank you, Mr. Starmer.
The opposition leader speaking a short while ago, calling for another general election or a general election. Whilst he was doing that, I got an email from Downing Street saying Boris Johnson has appointed Kit Malthouse to the cabinet as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. So he's actually carrying on as business as usual, even though we know he's going to resign, which is extraordinary. Let's speak to Nina, though, about that Keir Starmer interview. He's pushing for this election. I mean, this is the last thing, isn't it, that the Conservatives want or will allow, and they are in the stronger position in Parliament at the moment because the party's in a terrible state, and frankly, they'll lose seats. That's their feeling, at least.
Yeah, that's right, and particularly those vulnerable seats that are part of the sort of red wall, if you like, that they captured from Labour in sort of traditional blue-collar heartlands, particularly in the north of the UK, where the economic benefits of the kind of profligacy that you're seeing in the south, around London, that really hasn't trickled through. And that was supposed to be part of Boris Johnson's whole levelling up agenda, spending money in parts of the country that had been forgotten, that had been buffeted by years of Tory legacies of austerity, even Thatcher's policies to try and dismantle certain key industries in parts of the UK. It's a really sore point that has never really been dealt with. And many of those seats swung to Conservative in grand fashion back in 2019. Part of the big majority that Boris Johnson managed to deliver that hadn't been seen in generations was due to the fact that these people were galvanised by one subject, Brexit. Many of them voted Brexit because they felt that they hadn't reaped the benefits of globalisation and big trade deals, say, for instance, with the European Union. But now that obviously the legacy of Brexit is pretty patchy, and obviously there's a big question mark over trust in Boris Johnson's ability to tell the truth over all these issues, including Partygate. Lots of people have turned against him, and that's the fertile ground that Keir Starmer is referring to. But I would point out also that, you know, although Keir Starmer, during his term as the helm of the Labour Party, has done a good job in trying to steer this party back towards the centre ground after the far-left policies of Jeremy Corbyn, also anti-Semitism allegations and so on and so forth, he's tackled a lot of that. He's been criticised, though, for not having a vision of how to steer the economy back into healthy ground. We're right on the precipice of a recession here. The UK is the sixth largest economy in the world, worth about $2.5 to nearly $3 trillion, but it is going in reverse gear. And just today, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the watchdog, the financial watchdog that oversees the financial planning of the government, has said that tax cuts, forget it, take them off the cards because the country just can't afford it. So whether it's Keir Starmer, whether it's whoever's going to be the next Conservative Prime Minister, financially and fiscally, they're kind of blocked into an alleyway. So what people want to hear from Keir Starmer is a bit more concrete policies over how actually a Labour government would deliver a different prognosis for the electorate going forward.
OK, Nina, Bianca's here. Brought you in because Sebastian Payne, a very well-respected lobby correspondent, saying the Prime Minister's going to speak in 20 minutes.
Yes, that's what we're hearing at 12:30. So the big question is, what will he say? What will the tone be? Will this be a man who is remotely contrite, recognising that he's lost the confidence of his party, that through a series of unforced errors he's gone from a historic election victor to this situation, a Prime Minister with an unprecedented cascade of resignations from his own loyalists in some cases. You know, that's what we really need to look out for, and also what he's indicating about the months to come. So is this somebody who appears confident and like he wants to fulfill the role of Prime Minister to its largest extent until the day he walks out of that building? Or is this someone who will recognise that his time is done, someone else will come next, and he needs to be respectful of that transition period?
I'm fascinated by the fact he's been appointing cabinet ministers. There's a few more that have just come in on email, but also the fact that they've accepted those positions. Is that because he's saying, I want to make the appointment and it's agreed with my... I mean, what's going on?
Well, I would love to be a fly on the wall in those conversations, because did they accept those positions on the condition of what he said, which we don't know yet because we haven't heard the speech?
It suggests that he's going to stay in, doesn't it?
Well, perhaps he said to them, if these are people who would naturally be unwilling to join him in these circumstances, perhaps he said, look, I am resigning, I'm making that commitment, there'll be a leadership contest, join in the government in the meantime, we need to, you know, keep going for the country. Maybe he said that, or maybe he convinced them otherwise and said that this is my last-ditch attempt at a legacy, I'm full of energy, I want to make an impact in these few months and come along with me. We won't know until we hear that speech.
OK, so we're expecting Boris Johnson to speak in the next half hour, within the half hour. Obviously, the podium will come out first, and it will be a massive race on Twitter to mention it first.
It will be.
But we'll actually see it live here on television. And then he'll give his speech, and we don't know what's in it. We haven't been given any guidance whatsoever, but I guess he's going to be writing it to the last second.
Exactly, he will be.
Bit of ad-libbing, you think?
Possibly. I mean, he does do that.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see his tone, because what we've noticed over these last few weeks, after the confidence vote, when you and I were reporting at Downing Street, yesterday even, when he's under the most political threat, when he's in dire peril in terms of his career, he comes alive. He's got this energy. It's like he gets fired up with fight, and we see a different Johnson than we often see. We know, as is often stated by those close to him, he doesn't like the attention to detail. There are elements of the office of Prime Minister which bore him and he's not particularly enthusiastic about, and that does come across sometimes in PMQs and in certain arrangements, you know, in certain engagements that he has, that he doesn't really have a full grasp of the brief, and he's criticised for being a bit flippant. But that's not the case when he knows that his legacy is at stake. So we'll be seeing Prime Minister Boris Johnson's A-game today.
Yeah, we've never seen him this week, though, have we? He's accepted that he's going to resign, whereas in the past he's always battled through it.
Yeah.
I spoke a short while ago with Conservative Member of Parliament Steve Baker. This is what he had to say when I asked him how this has been going for him. That was my question.
Well, it's a very, very sad day today. I mean, I helped Boris Johnson become Prime Minister. I helped him get majority of 80. It's been a time of crisis for several years, so it's a very sad day. But honestly, I'm relieved. He's made the right decision. We now need to move swiftly to a leadership contest.
What about a caretaker Prime Minister? Who should that be?
It should be Dominic Raab, since he's the Deputy Prime Minister. It's a
so
formal
it shouldn't
role.
be Boris Johnson?
Well, so I am absolutely determined that we must not prolong this crisis. If it's agreed within government that Boris Johnson should continue as caretaker, then that's fine with me, because we need to just end the crisis, get into a leadership contest, start afresh in September. But for my preference, Dominic would step up, because I don't think it's in Boris's interests now to continue.
What are your colleagues saying about that? Is that the widespread view?
Well, this morning I've spent, I'm afraid, my time satisfying interviewers. I'm going to go back to Parliament.
You have
shortly.
WhatsApp, though.
I do, and WhatsApp is absolutely awash with media bids. So I hope your viewers will understand I need to get back into Parliament.
Is it very likely that he's going to come out and say, I'm going today?
I don't think it's very likely. My absolute priority right now is the political stability of the United Kingdom. If that means Boris continuing as caretaker, that's fine. But whether it's Boris or Dominic, what we need is just a policy of continuity now, and to focus on a leadership change.
If it's not Boris, is the general agreement that it should be Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, I think it's too early to say. We need to talk about that today. But he is, after all, the Deputy Prime Minister, and I would expect
And that's his job?
He took the job, he should do it.
I'm only asking because the name Graham Brady has been suggested to me as well as the chairman of the Backbench Committee.
But it would not normally be the case, I don't think, that the 1922 chairman would take it on. But
you know, Dominic Raab may wish to run for the leadership, but I will be plain. If I was in Dominic Raab's shoes, I would seek to deputise.
Would that discount him from running for the leadership if he was the caretaker?
If he did it, it would, yes.
So that makes it more complicated, doesn't it?
I'm afraid it does. No. But let's be clear about this. This is a thing I've mentioned because I believe in it.
Yeah.
But, I want us to have political stability. If that means Boris staying, that's fine.
What do you think he's going to say in his speech?
Well, I don't know, but I think he needs to rescue his legacy. I'm very, very clear that Boris Johnson rescued this country from a hideous political crisis in 2019. We tested our uncodified constitution almost to destruction, almost destroyed the Conservative Party, almost ushered in a hard-left Labour government that would have destroyed this country for generations. And Boris rescued us from all of that.
Because he had this fantastic victory in the general election.
Which some of us helped him get, yeah.
But at the same time, he's arguably destroyed it now to the point where if there was an election now, none of your party want one because you know you're going to lose your seats because he's been a disaster in recent months for the party.
I think well, yes, but let's just think about what people need in the UK. They need good quality government and a choice of good quality governments. We're in an extraordinary position at the moment. Clearly the Conservative Party isn't right now forming a good government. We need to sort that out. But the Labour Party's in a position where if Keir Starmer is fined, he might have to resign.
Okay,
so he's the leader of the opposition.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a beergate, they're calling it, where he was.
Yeah, he was videoed
drinking beer.
He was
during
videoed
lockdown.
having beers. Now he's very decently said he'll resign if he's fined, but we could not possibly go into an election with neither party well led.
Okay, in terms of just the mechanics on, you know, what happens in terms of voting, whether or not there'll be a caretaker, could you just explain how quickly that could happen and how that works?
Well, whether or not there's to be a caretaker is something that will be decided in government in the next few hours. But the mechanism is that we need to have elections amongst the Conservative Party for next leader, and that can happen in the next 2 weeks.
Let's bring in Bianca Novolo, who's here in Abingdon Green, hanging off the end of her stool.
Literally, I just nearly slipped off.
He's talking there, you know, I've talked to lots of backbenchers about this caretaker thing.
Yes.
Again, one of those examples where no one's really got an answer, which has never been done before.
Exactly.
But there's got to be a system in place. They'll have to vote for someone, presumably because it's the Conservatives, they won't agree on who it should be. I mean, how does it even work?
Well, all of this is confusing because the British Constitution, as we know, is uncodified, and those who say that's a good thing say that makes it flexible, but it obviously makes it confusing in situations like this. That's because there's no official position of an interim Prime Minister. Typically, in normal circumstances like David Cameron and Theresa May, when you resign, you stay on until your successor is found. But these circumstances are very different. No one doubted the integrity or the political disruption that Cameron or May could cause in that interim, so it was fine for them to stay on. The other alternative would be perhaps the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, as he stepped in for Johnson when he was hospitalised with COVID. He could step in as an interim Prime Minister.
That would require Boris now to say, I'm resigning as of today, and Raab would automatically step in,
Now, I don't think that's likely. And also, in theory, whoever would fill that role would probably rule them out of a leadership contest, just because of the way that things work. So, again, I think it's unlikely to find somebody who'd want to do that anyway. Then the other option, of course, is to force him out because the party feel like he can't continue. They don't trust his policy agenda in the meantime. They feel like he'll put his successor in a very difficult position. And I don't know, there might be some wranglings behind the scenes and they may try and orchestrate somebody else to take over. But that's why everybody's so on the edge of their stools, seats, and gripped by what might happen next, because nobody knows. And as we said earlier, Boris Johnson's never behaved in such a politically unpredictable manner as he has this last.
No, and the system actually allows that, doesn't it? In America, you've got a system where everything is very codified, and it's pretty clear what happens and who steps in when.
And also, we should mention to our viewers, this isn't a presidential system. So when people vote in the election, they don't vote for Boris Johnson, they vote for the Conservative Party. So that makes, when he's speaking about his mandate to continue and things, a lot more hollow, because nobody technically voted for him, indirectly, yes.
Which is what's infuriated MPs that I've been speaking to today, because he keeps talking about the mandate he has to push through his policy, and exactly the point. It's not a presidential system, but it does indicate how he actually views it, or his role as more of a presidential role.
And back in the day, he was immensely more popular than his party. Now, the reverse is true.
Okay, Nick Robertson there in Downing Street. We hear that in 10 minutes' time he's coming out. He's not always on time, is he? But that's the briefing we're getting, so it feels pretty imminent, and there's a helicopter above me, which often suggests the same.
Yeah, Max, what I can tell you from down here, they're starting to roll out the cables, and if I ask Luke just to sort of pan over slightly to the right here, you can see the speakers have been put out so that we can all hear the Prime Minister. So it's happening, it's in process, and no podium, but that can be brought out in short order. The audio system seems to be pretty much in place now, so the Prime Minister could make it as expected for 12:30 here. That would be 10 minutes from now. It sounds like it's going to have some competition from all the people that are gathered at the ends of Downing Street here behind the big fortified gates. Somebody's playing a music system that's very loud. You might be able to hear it. It might have been down where you were earlier. We heard it around here yesterday. But the Prime Minister is not going to get an easy go of it from his competition at the end of the street. What we're expecting is for the Prime Minister to come out, burnish his credentials, and talk about where he has succeeded. Now, we've talked in the past 24 hours about the number of people who've resigned, and what we're seeing at the moment is what is traditional speeches by the Prime Minister. We're seeing a number of people coming out of their office here, coming out of number 11 next door to Downing Street to be able to watch directly. Oftentimes these are people who work inside number 10, inside number 11 in the Chancellor's office, will come out and watch their boss give a resignation speech. So everything is falling into place now. Just the podium and the Prime Minister, and of course the content of his speech.
In the Donbass and across.
You can see there, let me just get out of the way of the picture, you can see there the lectern, the podium in front of the door of number 10, outside number 11, staff.
Henry, you all right there? And how's that? All right. It's ready. Right, I need to... Freddie, can we get it centred on the door? Is your remote focused? Be all right, be all right. That's not the lowest it could go. Yeah, can we get it up?
You need a bit that way, don't you? Ready?
Turn it a little bit. Okay, I'm going to sit down.
Ready? This is the main camera. You need to... I need it a bit that way. No, slide it that way. This time. Speak to him.
I don't know how to get that sharp. I mean, is that going to be sharp? It's supposed to do face up now. I'm going to be here. Are you okay behind me? I'll try to stay as low as I can.
Good, okay. Toby, good?